Surrounded by the oppressive darkness of the woods, each noise amplifies my dread. The air vibrates with the presence of something ancient and hungry. My sanity shatters as I glimpse the grotesque form of a predator that defies nature itself. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we begin today's attack report, I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe. Also, write now in the comments which city you're watching from. We'd love to know. All of this because I never should have gone camping alone. That's what everyone tells me now, but hindsight is 20/20, isn't it? My name is Greg Mitchell, and this is the story of how my life changed forever in the span of 48 hours. It was a crisp autumn morning when I packed up my old Jeep Cherokee and headed out of Denver. The city had been suffocating me lately. The constant noise, the endless stream of people, the pressure of my job as a software developer. I needed an escape, just for a weekend. Just me, the wilderness, and the promise of peace and quiet. As I drove west on I-70, the towering Rocky Mountains loomed ahead, their peaks already dusted with early snow. I felt a mix of excitement and apprehension building in my chest. It had been years since I'd gone on a solo camping trip, but I was confident in my outdoor skills. I'd chosen a remote spot in the Pike National Forest, far from the usual tourist trails. "You sure about this, Greg?" my sister Sarah had asked when I told her my plans. "Why not go to a campground at least?" "I'll be fine," I had assured her, rolling my eyes. "I need some real solitude, you know? No RVs, no screaming kids, just me and nature." If only I had listened to her concerns. As I turned off the highway onto a winding mountain road, an eerie silence settled over my car. The radio signal had long since faded, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the steady hum of the engine. The forest pressed in on both sides, the trees growing denser and more imposing with each mile. "It's just nerves," I muttered to myself, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "You wanted solitude, remember?" But as I drove deeper into the wilderness, doubt began to creep in. The shadows between the trees seemed to stretch and deepen, and more than once I could have sworn I saw something large moving just beyond the tree line. My rational mind dismissed it as deer or elk, but a primal part of me whispered warnings I couldn't quite ignore. After what felt like hours, I finally reached the small, unmarked parking area that served as the trailhead. As I stepped out of the car, the silence hit me like a physical force. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I shouldered my heavy backpack, double-checked that I had my map and compass, and set off down the overgrown path. With each step, the feeling of being watched intensified. I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder, my heart rate picking up despite the easy terrain. "Get it together," I chided myself. "This is what you wanted, isn't it?" But even as I said the words, I couldn't shake the growing sense of unease. The trail seemed to wind endlessly through the forest, each turn revealing more of the same. Towering pines, dense underbrush, and an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow every sound I made. After about 2 hours of hiking, I finally reached the small clearing I had marked as my campsite. It was nestled against a rocky hillside with a small stream gurgling nearby. Under normal circumstances, it would have been idyllic. But as I stood there surveying the open space, I felt terribly exposed. "This is ridiculous," I said aloud, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. "You're letting your imagination run wild, Greg. There's nothing out here but trees and rocks." Forcing myself to focus on the practical tasks at hand, I set about making camp. I pitched my tent, gathered firewood, and set up a small cooking area. The physical activity helped calm my nerves, and by the time I had a small fire crackling, I was feeling more like myself. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the clearing, I heated up a packet of freeze-dried stroganoff and settled in for a quiet evening. The fire cast a warm, comforting glow, and I found myself relaxing for the first time since I'd entered the forest. "See," I said to myself, taking a sip from my thermos of coffee. "This is exactly what you needed. Peace and quiet." But as night fell in earnest, The forest came alive with unfamiliar sounds. Branches creaked and snapped in the darkness beyond my firelight. Something that sounded much larger than a raccoon or fox rustled through the underbrush, and just once, I heard a low, rumbling sound that might have been a growl, or might have been my imagination playing tricks on me. I huddled closer to the fire, suddenly wishing I had brought a gun or at least a larger knife than my small Swiss Army blade. "It's just normal forest sounds," I whispered, but the words rang hollow even to my own ears. As the fire began to die down, I reluctantly prepared for bed. Every instinct screamed at me to stay awake, to keep watch. But I knew I needed rest for the hike I had planned the next day. With shaking hands, I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, my flashlight clutched tightly in one hand. The thin walls of the tent suddenly seemed absurdly inadequate protection against whatever might be out there. "There's nothing out there," I said firmly, trying to convince myself. "Just go to sleep, Greg. Everything will look better in the morning." But as I lay there in the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar night sounds of the forest, sleep seemed impossibly far away. Every rustle, every snap of a twig, sent my heart racing. I found myself straining to identify each sound, to convince myself that it was just the wind, just a small animal, just my imagination. Hours passed, and I drifted in and out of a fitful doze. And then, just as I was finally starting to relax, I heard it. A sound that jolted me fully awake, my body rigid with fear, the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps moving slowly but deliberately around the perimeter of my campsite. "Hello?" I called out, my voice embarrassingly shaky. "Is someone there?" No response came, but the footsteps continued. Whatever it was big, much too big to be a person. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands slick with cold sweat. Should I look? Did I want to see what was out there? Before I could decide, a low, rumbling growl cut through the night air. It was unlike anything I had ever heard before, not quite bear, not quite mountain lion, but something other. Something that sent ice-cold fear coursing through my veins. I lay there, paralyzed, as the creature, whatever it was, continued to circle my tent. Its breathing was heavy, almost labored, and I could smell a musky animal odor that seemed to seep through the tent walls. "This isn't happening," I whispered to myself, squeezing my eyes shut. "This can't be real. I'm dreaming. I have to be dreaming." But the footsteps, the breathing, the smell, it was all too vivid, too present to be a dream. As the night wore on, I remained frozen in my sleeping bag, too terrified to move, to breathe, to do anything but listen to the monster that stalked just outside my fragile shelter. As the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the trees, the sounds finally faded away. But the fear remained, a cold, hard knot in the pit of my stomach, because I knew with a certainty that defied all logic and reason that whatever had visited my camp in the night would be back. And next time, a thin layer of nylon might not be enough to keep it at bay. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke with a start, my heart pounding. The early morning light filtered through the tent fabric, casting everything in a pale, ghostly glow. For a moment I couldn't remember where I was, or why I felt so terrified. Then it all came rushing back, the night, the sounds, the presence circling my tent. I lay there, straining my ears for any sign that the thing was still out there. The forest was quiet, almost unnaturally so. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals. Just an oppressive silence that seemed to press down on me. "Get a grip, Greg," I muttered to myself, trying to summon the courage to unzip the tent. "It was just your imagination. Probably a deer or something." But even as I said the words, I knew they weren't true. Whatever had been out there last night was no deer. With shaking hands, I finally managed to unzip the tent flap. The cool morning air hit my face, carrying with it the scent of pine and damp earth. I poked my head out, half expecting to see some monstrous creature looming over me. But the clearing was empty, peaceful in the early light. I crawled out of the tent, my muscles stiff from a night of tension. That's when I saw them, the footprints. Oh God, I whispered, my breath catching in my throat. Massive, unmistakable footprints circled my tent. They were easily twice the size of my own foot, with clear impressions of toes and a shape that was disturbingly human-like, yet not quite right. The stride length was enormous, indicating something far larger than any human. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of joke, right? But who would come all the way out here just to scare a lone camper? With trembling hands, I pulled out my phone to take pictures, but to my frustration, I found I had no signal. Of course not. I was miles from the nearest cell tower. Okay. Think, I said aloud, trying to calm myself. What would a rational person do in this situation? The answer was clear. Pack up and get the hell out of there. But a part of me, the part that had always been fascinated by cryptozoology and unexplained phenomena, wanted to investigate further. It was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, wasn't it? Against my better judgment, I decided to stay, at least for a few more hours. I'd hike around the area, see if I could find any more evidence. Then I'd leave, I promised myself. I'd go straight to the rangers and report what I'd found. After a quick breakfast of granola bars and instant coffee, my appetite was pretty much non-existent anyway. I packed a day bag and set off into the woods. I made sure to mark my trail carefully, leaving small piles of stones at regular intervals. The last thing I needed was to get lost out here. As I hiked deeper into the forest, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder. But the woods remained stubbornly empty of any visible threat. "Hello?" I called out at one point, immediately regretting it as my voice echoed unnaturally through the trees. "Is anyone there?" Only silence answered me. I pressed on, my eyes scanning the ground for any sign of those massive footprints. But the forest floor was a mess of fallen leaves and pine needles, obscuring any clear tracks. After about an hour of hiking, I came across a small clearing. What I saw there made my blood run cold. A young deer lay on the ground, its body torn apart, as if by some incredibly powerful predator. The kill looked fresh, probably from last night. "Bears don't do this," I muttered, looking at the way the carcass had been ripped open. "Mountain lions don't either." As I stood there, trying to process what I was seeing, a blood-curdling roar echoed through the trees. It was the same sound I'd heard last night, but louder, closer, and undeniably real. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The roar came again, and this time I could pinpoint the direction. It was coming from the way I'd come, from my campsite. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to move slowly, quietly. Whatever had made that sound, I didn't want to attract its attention. I began to make my way back towards camp, every sense on high alert. The forest seemed to close in around me as I walked. Shadows deepened, and more than once I thought I saw something large moving just at the edge of my vision, but every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. "It's just your imagination," I kept telling myself. "You're scaring yourself for no reason." But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. There was something out there, something big, something dangerous, and it was hunting me. As I neared my campsite, the silence was broken by the sound of ripping fabric and crunching plastic. My heart sank. I knew what I would find before I even entered the clearing. My camp was destroyed. The tent lay in tatters, my sleeping bag ripped to shreds. My backpack had been torn open, its contents strewn across the ground. But what really caught my attention were the claw marks gouged deep into the nearby trees. They were huge, far larger than any bear could make. "This isn't happening," I said aloud, my voice shaking. "This can't be real." But it was real, all too real. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that I was in serious danger. I had to get out of there, now. I quickly gathered what supplies I could salvage, shoving them haphazardly into my torn backpack. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely zip it closed. Just as I was about to leave, I heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I spun around, my eyes darting from tree to tree, trying to spot the source of the sound. And then I saw it. Just for a moment, a massive, hair-covered silhouette at the edge of the clearing. Its eyes gleamed with an intelligence that was decidedly not animal, not human either. Something other. I didn't wait to see more. I ran. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush, no longer caring about stealth or leaving a trail. All that mattered was putting as much distance as possible between myself and that thing. I could hear it behind me, its heavy footsteps shaking the ground. It was fast, much faster than something that size should be able to move. And it was gaining on me. As I ran, my mind raced with fragmented thoughts. Bigfoot. It had to be. But Bigfoot wasn't real, was it? It was just a myth, a legend. But if that was true, then what the hell was chasing me? I didn't have time to ponder these questions. All I could do was run, driven by a primal fear that overrode all rational thought. I had no idea where I was going, no plan beyond escape. As the sound of pursuit grew ever closer, one thought crystallized in my mind with terrifying clarity. I was about to come face to face with a monster, and I might not survive the encounter. The chase was on and I was the prey. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. The forest blurred around me, a chaotic mess of green and brown. I had no idea how long I'd been running or in which direction. All I knew was that I had to keep moving, had to get away from whatever was pursuing me. Eventually, I couldn't run anymore. I stumbled to a stop, gasping for air, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I leaned against a tree, trying to catch my breath and listen for any signs of pursuit. The forest was eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just the sound of my own ragged breathing. "It's gone," I whispered to myself, desperately wanting to believe it. "You lost it. You're safe now." But even as I said the words, I knew they weren't true. The silence wasn't reassuring. It was oppressive, unnatural, like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As my breathing slowly returned to normal, I tried to take stock of my situation. I was lost, that much was certain. In my panic, I'd run blindly, with no regard for direction or landmarks. My backpack was gone, lost somewhere during my frantic flight. With it went my water, my food, my map, and compass. All I had was the clothes on my back and the Swiss Army knife in my pocket. "Okay, Greg," I muttered to myself. "Think. What's the smart move here? Stay put and wait for rescue? No, that wasn't an option. Not with that thing out there. Try to find my way back to the trail? Maybe, but I had no idea which direction to go. My best bet, I decided, was to try to find higher ground. If I could get a view of the surrounding area, maybe I could spot a road or a landmark. With this plan in mind, I chose a direction that seemed to be uphill and started walking. The forest was dense, the underbrush thick and tangled. More than once, I had to backtrack to find a passable route. The late afternoon sun filtered weakly through the canopy, casting long shadows that seemed to move and shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see a monstrous figure looming behind me. But there was never anything there, just trees and shadows. After what felt like hours of walking, I finally reached a small clearing on a ridgeline. The view wasn't great, just more trees as far as the eye could see, but at least I could see the sun setting in the west. That gave me some sense of direction. As I stood there trying to decide what to do next, I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I spun around, my heart racing, searching for the source of the sound. And then I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, Partially hidden by the lengthening shadows stood a massive, hair-covered figure. It was easily 8 feet tall with a broad, powerful build. Its face was a nightmarish blend of human and ape-like features, with deep-set eyes that gleamed with an unsettling intelligence. Bigfoot. There was no other word for it. The creature of legend was standing right in front of me, and it looked anything but friendly. I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. The creature's foul stench hit me like a physical force, a mixture of wet fur, rotting meat, and something else, something indescribably alien. For a moment, we just stared at each other. I found myself hoping, irrationally, that maybe it was just curious. Maybe it didn't mean me any harm. That hope was shattered when the creature let out a deafening roar and charged straight at me. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I just reacted. I turned and ran, fueled by pure, primal terror. The clearing wasn't large, and I reached the tree line in seconds. I plunged back into the forest, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. Behind me, I could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush. It was fast, impossibly fast for something so large. I could feel its hot breath on the back of my neck, smell its rank odor getting stronger. In my panic, I made a crucial mistake. Instead of continuing straight, I veered to the side, hoping to lose it in the denser part of the forest. But in doing so, I lost my footing on the uneven ground. I went down hard, tumbling head over heels down a steep slope. I came to a stop at the bottom, dazed and winded. Before I could get up, before I could even catch my breath, a massive shadow fell over me. I looked up to see the Bigfoot looming above, its eyes glinting with what I can only describe as malevolent glee. Its hand shot out, impossibly fast, and grabbed me by the front of my shirt. With terrifying ease, it lifted me off the ground until we were face to face. This close, I could see every detail of its features: the matted fur, the yellowed teeth, the disturbingly human-like eyes. I was certain in that moment that I was about to die. But some stubborn part of me, some core of survival instinct, refused to give up. With strength born of desperation, I lashed out, kicking and punching for all I was worth. My blows seemed to have no effect on the creature. It was like hitting a brick wall. But then, by sheer luck, my flailing hand found the Swiss Army knife in my pocket. Without thinking, I pulled it out and stabbed blindly. The blade sank into the creature's arm. It wasn't a deep wound. The knife was too small for that. But it was enough. The Bigfoot roared in pain and anger, releasing its grip on me. I fell to the ground, the impact knocking the wind out of me. But I didn't have time to recover. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not daring to look back. I could hear the creature's enraged roars behind me, spurring me to run faster than I thought possible. I had no idea where I was going. All I knew was that I had to get away, had to find somewhere safe. As I ran, I spotted a gap between 2 large boulders. Without hesitation, I dove for it. The space was tight, barely big enough for me to squeeze into, but it was my only chance. I crawled in as far as I could, pressing myself against the cold stone. Moments later, the Bigfoot arrived. I could see its massive form through the narrow opening, could hear its heavy breathing and low, angry growls. It reached into the crevice, its huge hand clawing at the air just inches from my face. But it couldn't reach me. The gap was too narrow for its large frame. For what felt like hours, I huddled in that tiny space, watching in terror as the creature tried again and again to get to me. It roared in frustration, pounding on the rocks, but the boulders held firm. As night fell, the attacks became less frequent. But I didn't dare move. I stayed there, cramped and cold, listening to every sound, starting at every shadow. I knew that somewhere out there in the darkness, the monster was waiting. And I knew that sooner or later I would have to leave my sanctuary and face it again. The night stretched on and I waited, trapped between unyielding stone and an implacable predator, for the dawn that seemed like it would never come. The first light of dawn filtered through the narrow opening of my rocky shelter, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I hadn't slept a wink, my body tense and alert, ears straining for any sound of the creature's return. The night had been eerily quiet, punctuated only by the occasional distant roar that sent shivers down my spine. As the forest slowly brightened, I knew I couldn't stay in this crevice forever. I was dehydrated, hungry, and my muscles screamed from being cramped in one position for so long. I had to move, had to try to find my way back to civilization. But the thought of leaving my sanctuary filled me with dread. "Come on, Greg," I whispered to myself, my voice hoarse from fear and thirst. "You can't stay here forever. You have to move." Slowly, painfully, I began to inch my way out of the narrow space between the boulders. Every movement was agony, my joints stiff and muscles protesting. As I emerged into the open air, I half expected to see the creature looming over me. But the small clearing was empty, peaceful in the early morning light. I stood on shaky legs, scanning the surrounding forest for any sign of movement. Nothing, just trees and underbrush, looking deceptively normal in the soft dawn light. But I knew better now. I knew what was hiding out there. Taking a deep breath, I tried to orient myself. The sun was rising to my right, which meant east. If I headed west, I should eventually hit the road I'd driven in on. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all I had. With one last glance at my rocky shelter, I set off, moving as quietly as I could through the underbrush. Every step was an exercise in terror. Every snapping twig under my feet sounded like a gunshot in the quiet forest. Every rustle of leaves had me freezing in place, heart pounding, sure that this was the moment the creature would appear. But nothing happened. For what felt like hours, I made my way through the forest, the terrain gradually becoming steeper and more difficult to navigate. My throat was parched, my stomach growling with hunger. But I didn't dare stop to look for water or food. All I could think about was getting out of this nightmare. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the forest began to thin out. I found myself on a rocky slope, the trees more scattered, offering less cover, but it also gave me a better view of my surroundings. In the distance, I could see a valley, and beyond that, more mountains. No sign of roads or buildings. I was still deep in the wilderness. That's when I heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath my feet. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. There, at the edge of the tree line below me, stood the creature. Even from this distance, I could see the intelligence in its eyes, the purposeful way it moved. This was no mindless animal. This was a predator, and I was its prey. For a moment, we just stared at each other, frozen in a tableau of hunter and hunted. Then, with a roar that shook the mountainside, it charged. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I just ran. With my heart pounding in my ears, I scrambled up the rocky slope, my feet slipping on loose stones. I could hear the creature's heavy footsteps behind me, getting closer with each passing second. It was fast, impossibly fast for something so large. "Oh God, oh God, oh God," I panted as I ran, my lungs burning with each breath. I didn't dare look back, focusing all my energy on putting one foot in front of the other, on finding handholds in the rocky terrain. I crested a ridge, hoping against hope to see some sign of civilization on the other side. Instead, I found myself at the edge of a steep drop-off. Below, a raging river cut through the valley, its waters white with foam as it crashed over rocks. I skidded to a stop, nearly losing my balance. There was nowhere left to run. I turned, my back to the cliff edge, to face my pursuer. The Bigfoot emerged from the tree line, its massive form silhouetted against the morning sky. It moved with an eerie grace, picking its way through the rocky terrain with ease. Its eyes were fixed on me, filled with a predatory focus that chilled me to my core. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. "Just leave me alone." But my words had no effect. The creature continued its advance, a low growl rumbling from its chest. I could smell its rank odor on the wind, a mixture of wet fur and something indescribably alien. I looked around desperately for something, anything I could use as a weapon. My hand closed around a fist-sized rock. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. As the Bigfoot drew closer, I hurled the rock with all my strength. By some miracle, it struck the creature square in the face. The Bigfoot roared in pain and anger, momentarily stunned. I seized the opportunity, darting to the side, trying to circle around it and make a break for the trees. but I had underestimated its speed and reflexes. With shocking quickness, it lunged, its massive hand closing around my ankle. I went down hard, the breath knocked from my lungs as I hit the rocky ground. The next few moments were a blur of terror and pain. I kicked and thrashed, trying desperately to break free. But the creature's grip was like iron. It began to drag me across the ground back towards the forest. In my panic, my hand closed around another rock. With all the strength I had left, I swung it at the Bigfoot's arm. There was a sickening crunch, and the creature let out a roar of pain. Its grip loosened just enough for me to wrench my ankle free. I scrambled to my feet and ran, ignoring the pain shooting through my body. I had no plan, no destination in mind. All I knew was that I had to get away. Branches whipped at my face as I plunged back into the forest, my feet barely touching the ground. I could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush behind me, its enraged roars spurring me to run faster than I thought possible. I had no idea how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning, reduced to the rhythm of my pounding feet and gasping breaths. My world narrowed to a tunnel of green and brown, broken only by the flashes of sunlight that managed to penetrate the canopy. Just when I thought I couldn't run another step, when my legs were about to give out beneath me, I burst out of the tree line onto a narrow dirt road. In the distance, I could hear the faint rumble of an engine. Hope surged through me, giving me a final burst of energy. I ran down the road, waving my arms frantically, praying that whoever was coming would see me. As I rounded a bend, I saw it, an old pickup truck rattling down the road towards me. I stumbled into the middle of the road, my arms outstretched. "Stop!" I screamed. "Please stop!" The truck screeched to a halt just feet away from me. An old man leaned out of the driver's window, his weathered face creased with concern. "Son, are you all right?" he called out. I opened my mouth to answer, to explain, to beg for help. But before I could utter a word, a deafening roar echoed through the forest behind me. I turned, my blood running cold. There, at the edge of the tree line, stood the Bigfoot. For a moment, our eyes met. I saw fury in its gaze, but also, was that frustration? Disappointment? Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it melted back into the forest, leaving no trace of its presence. I turned back to the truck, my legs finally giving out beneath me. As I collapsed to the ground, the last thing I saw was the old man rushing towards me, concern etched on his face. Then darkness claimed me, and I knew no more. I came to with a start, my heart racing, and my body drenched in cold sweat. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was or what had happened. Then it all came flooding back, the chase, the creature, the old man in the truck. "Easy there, son," a gruff voice said. "You're safe now." I blinked, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. I was lying on a worn couch in what looked like a small cabin. The old man from the truck was sitting in a rocking chair nearby, concern etched on his weathered face. Where am I?" I croaked, my throat painfully dry. "My cabin," the old man replied, handing me a glass of water. "Name's Bill. Found you on the road looking like you'd seen the devil himself. Brought you here to rest up." I gulped down the water gratefully, my hands shaking. "Thank you," I managed. "I'm Greg. I was camping and..." The words caught in my throat. How could I explain what had happened? Who would believe me? Bill seemed to sense my hesitation. "Whatever it was, son, you're safe now. That's what matters." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. My whole body ached and I could feel scratches and bruises all over, but I was alive. That was more than I'd hoped for just a few hours ago. "What time is it?" I asked, suddenly realizing I had no idea how long I'd been out. "Just past noon," Bill replied. "You've been asleep for a couple hours. Looked like you needed it." I sat up slowly, wincing at the pain. Through the cabin's small window, I could see the forest looming dark and ominous. Even in the bright afternoon sun, it seemed threatening. "I need to get out of here," I said, a note of panic creeping into my voice. "It's not safe. We're not safe." Bill leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "What exactly happened out there, Greg? What's got you so spooked?" I hesitated, weighing my options. I needed help, that much was clear. But would he believe me? Would anyone? Taking a deep breath, I decided to take the risk. "You're going to think I'm crazy," I began, "but I swear every word is true." And so I told him everything. The footprints around my camp, the destroyed tent, the chase through the forest. And the creature, the massive, terrifying being that had hunted me relentlessly. As I spoke, Bill's expression changed from concern to disbelief, and finally to something I couldn't quite read. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. "Bigfoot," he said finally, his voice neutral. "That's what you're saying you saw." I nodded, bracing myself for the ridicule I was sure would follow. But Bill surprised me. "You're not the first, you know," he said quietly. "Over the years I've heard stories. Hunters, hikers, even a forest ranger once. All telling tales of something big out there in the woods. Something that ain't natural." Hope surged through me. You believe me?" Bill shrugged. "I've lived in these mountains for 60 years, son. Seen things I can't explain. I don't know what's out there, but I know these woods ain't always safe." His words sent a chill down my spine. I glanced out the window again, half expecting to see the creature's face pressed against the glass. "We need to call the police," I said. "Or the Forest Service. Someone needs to know about this." Bill shook his head. "Phone lines are down. Storm last week took 'em out. Nearest town's about 20 miles from here." My heart sank. We were isolated, cut off. And somewhere out there, the creature was still hunting. As if reading my thoughts, Bill stood up. "Sun'll be setting in a few hours. You're welcome to stay the night. We'll head into town in the morning, get you some help." I nodded gratefully, relief washing over me. The thought of spending another night in the forest was unbearable. As Bill busied himself preparing a simple dinner, I found myself drawn to the window. The forest seemed peaceful in the afternoon light, but I knew better now. I knew what was hiding out there. "You said others have seen it," I said, not taking my eyes off the tree line. "Why hasn't anyone done anything? Why isn't this common knowledge?" Bill sighed heavily. "People have tried, son, but without proof, who's going to believe it? Most folks write it off as bears or overactive imaginations. And those who do believe, well, they tend to keep quiet. Folks don't take kindly to being called crazy." I understood that all too well. Even now, part of me wondered if I was losing my mind. If it weren't for the very real scratches and bruises on my body, I might have convinced myself it was all a nightmare. As the afternoon wore on, I helped Bill secure the cabin. We checked the locks, closed the shutters, and Bill even produced an old shotgun from a closet. "Just in case," he said grimly. Night fell, and with it came an oppressive silence. No crickets chirped, no owls hooted. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves outside had me on edge. I sat by the window, peering out into the darkness, jumping at every shadow. It was nearing midnight when I saw it. A flicker of movement at the edge of the clearing. Then emerging from the tree line, a massive, hair-covered figure. "Bill," I hissed, my voice tight with fear. "It's here." The old man was at my side in an instant, shotgun in hand. His eyes widened as he saw the creature. "Sweet Jesus," he whispered. The Bigfoot stood at the edge of the clearing, its eyes reflecting the moonlight like a cat's. It seemed to be studying the cabin, looking for a way in. "What do we do?" I asked, panic rising in my chest, Bill's jaw set in a determined line. "We wait. That door's solid oak. Windows are barred. Long as we stay inside, we should be safe." But even as he spoke, the creature began to move closer. Its massive form cast a long shadow in the moonlight as it approached the cabin. We watched in terrified silence as it circled the building, testing the walls, the door, the shuttered windows. I could hear its heavy breathing, smell its rank odor even through the walls. For hours, this continued. The creature would retreat to the tree line, then approach again, each time seeming more agitated, more determined to get in. As dawn began to break, painting the sky in pale pinks and golds, the Bigfoot finally retreated into the forest. But I knew with a certainty that chilled me to my core that this wasn't over. It was out there, waiting, and sooner or later we would have to leave the safety of the cabin. As Bill and I exchanged grim looks, I realized that our ordeal was far from over. The real test was yet to come. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the cabin's shuttered windows, Bill and I exchanged weary glances. Neither of us had slept, our nerves frayed from the night's ordeal. "We need to make a run for it," I said, my voice hoarse from fear and exhaustion. "Your truck, can it make it to town?" Bill nodded grimly. "She ain't pretty, but she's reliable. We'll have to risk it." We spent the next hour preparing for our escape. Bill gathered some supplies, water, a first aid kit, and his shotgun. I paced nervously by the window, scanning the tree line for any sign of the creature. "Remember," Bill said as we prepared to leave, "if we get separated, keep heading east. The town's about 20 miles that way." I nodded, trying to quell the fear rising in my chest. The thought of being alone in the forest again, with that thing out there, was almost unbearable. With a deep breath, Bill unbolted the door. The morning air was crisp and clean, a stark contrast to the stuffy interior of the cabin. For a moment, everything seemed peaceful. Birds chirped, a gentle breeze rustled the leaves. It was hard to believe that just hours ago, a monster had been prowling these woods. We made our way to Bill's old pickup truck, our eyes darting back and forth, watching for any movement. The forest seemed to press in around us, the shadows between the trees deep and menacing. As we reached the truck, a twig snapped somewhere in the underbrush. We froze, our hearts pounding. "Get in," Bill whispered urgently. "Now." We scrambled into the truck, Bill fumbling with the keys. The engine sputtered once, twice, before roaring to life. Just as Bill threw the truck into gear, a deafening roar split the air. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood the Bigfoot. In the clear light of day, it was even more terrifying than I remembered. Its massive frame was covered in matted, reddish-brown fur. Its face was a nightmarish blend of ape and man, with deep-set eyes that gleamed with malevolent intelligence. "Go, go, go!" I shouted as the creature charged towards us. Bill floored the accelerator, and we shot forward, tires spinning in the dirt. The Bigfoot's massive hand slammed into the rear of the truck as we pulled away, the impact nearly sending us off the narrow dirt road. "It's following us," I yelled, watching in horror as the creature loped after the truck with impossible speed. Bill said nothing, his knuckles white on the steering wheel as he navigated the winding forest road. Trees whipped past us in a green blur. The truck bounced and jolted over the uneven terrain, each bump sending spikes of pain through my battered body. For a while it seemed we might outrun it. The Bigfoot fell behind, disappearing from view around a bend in the road. I began to breathe a little easier, hope rising in my chest. Then, without warning, a massive form burst from the trees ahead of us. "Look out!" I screamed. Bill swerved hard, narrowly avoiding a collision with the Bigfoot. The truck fishtailed, tires skidding on the loose gravel. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought we were going to flip. Then Bill regained control and we shot forward once more. But our troubles were far from over. The creature was right behind us now, so close I could see the rage in its eyes through the rearview mirror. "We're not going to make it," I said, panic rising in my voice. "It's too fast." Bill's jaw was set in a grim line. "We ain't got a choice, son. We stop now, we're dead." As if to emphasize his point, the Bigfoot's hand slammed into the side of the truck, leaving a massive dent in the metal. The impact sent us careening towards the edge of the road. "Hold on!" Bill yelled as we plunged off the dirt track and into the underbrush. Branches whipped at the windshield as we crashed through the forest. I clung to the dashboard, my heart in my throat. Behind us, I could hear the creature crashing through the trees in pursuit. Suddenly, the trees thinned out, and we burst into a small clearing. A stream cut through the middle, its waters white with foam as it rushed over rocks. "We're gonna have to cross it," Bill shouted over the roar of the engine. Before I could respond, we hit the water. The truck lurched violently as it plowed into the stream. Water sprayed up over the hood, momentarily blinding us. For a terrifying moment, I thought we were going to stall out in the middle of the stream. The engine sputtered and coughed, water seeping in around our feet. But then, with a final surge of power, we made it to the other side. As we clawed our way up the opposite bank, I looked back. The Bigfoot stood at the edge of the stream, its massive form heaving with exertion. For a moment, our eyes met. I saw fury in its gaze, but also, was that frustration? Then, to my amazement, it turned and melted back into the forest. We did it, I gasped, hardly daring to believe it. We got away. Bill didn't respond. I turned to see him slumped over the steering wheel, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead. "Bill!" I cried, shaking his shoulder. "Bill, wake up!" But the old man was out cold. And as I looked around, I realized with growing horror that I had no idea where we were. The unfamiliar forest stretched out in all directions, with no sign of a road or civilization. We had escaped the Bigfoot, but our ordeal was far from over. As I sat there, the engine ticking as it cooled, I knew that our next challenge was just beginning. Somewhere out there, beyond the trees, was safety. But between us and that safety lay miles of wilderness, and in that wilderness a monster was hunting. With shaking hands, I reached for the first aid kit. As I tended to Bill's wound, I tried to steel myself for what was to come. We weren't out of the woods yet, literally or figuratively. And I had a sinking feeling that the Bigfoot wasn't done with us, not by a long shot. The silence that followed our chaotic escape was almost deafening. The only sounds were the gentle babbling of the stream we'd just crossed and Bill's labored breathing. I'd managed to stop the bleeding from his head wound, but he remained unconscious, slumped over the steering wheel. "Bill," I said, gently shaking his shoulder. "Bill, come on, man, we can't stay here." No response. I looked around nervously, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The forest seemed peaceful, but I knew better now. Danger could be lurking just beyond my sight. I had to make a decision. We couldn't stay in the truck. It was too exposed, and the Bigfoot could return at any moment. But I couldn't leave Bill behind either. With a deep breath, I made my choice. "All right, Bill," I muttered, more to myself than to him. "Let's get you out of here." It took all my strength to maneuver Bill's unconscious form out of the driver's seat. My muscles screamed in protest, reminding me of the ordeal I'd already been through. But fear and adrenaline kept me going. I managed to get Bill's arm over my shoulder and started half carrying, half dragging him away from the truck. Each step was agony, my body protesting the added weight, but the memory of those inhuman eyes, that massive form charging at us, spurred me on. "Just a little further," I panted, though I had no real destination in mind. We'd gone maybe 100 yards when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath my feet. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Slowly, I turned my head towards the sound. There, on the other side of the stream, stood the Bigfoot. Even from this distance, I could see the rage in its eyes, the way its massive hands clenched and unclenched at its sides. For a moment, we just stared at each other, predator and prey locked in a silent standoff. Then, with a roar that shook the trees, it charged into the stream. Panic surged through me. I tried to move faster, but Bill's weight was slowing me down. The splashing behind me grew louder as the creature crossed the water. "I'm sorry, Bill," I gasped, and with a surge of desperate strength, I managed to hoist him over my shoulder in a fireman's carry. I ran. I ran like I'd never run before, my lungs burning, my legs feeling like they might give out at any moment. But the sound of pursuit behind me kept me going, terror lending me strength I didn't know I possessed. The forest blurred around me as I crashed through underbrush, leaped over fallen logs, and ducked under low-hanging branches. All the while I could hear the Bigfoot gaining on us, its heavy footfalls shaking the ground. Just when I thought my strength would give out, I spotted a gap between two large boulders ahead. It was narrow, too narrow for the Bigfoot to follow, and seemed to lead into a small cave. With the last of my energy, I made a final sprint for the opening. The creature's hot breath was on the back of my neck, its growls so close I could almost feel the vibrations in my chest. I dove for the gap, twisting my body to protect Bill as much as I could. We hit the ground hard, sliding several feet into the cave. Behind us, I heard the Bigfoot roar in frustration as it tried to reach in after us, its massive hand clawing at the air just inches from my feet. For what felt like hours, I lay there, gasping for breath, listening to the creature's angry roars and the sound of its fists pounding on the rocks outside. But the boulders held firm. We were safe, at least for the moment. As my breathing slowly returned to normal, I became aware of a warm, sticky sensation on my chest. Looking down, I saw with horror that my shirt was soaked with blood. In the chaos of our escape, I hadn't even noticed the Bigfoot's claws raking across my chest. "Oh, God," I whispered, gingerly touching the wounds. They were deep, and they hurt like hell now that the adrenaline was wearing off. Next to me, Bill groaned softly. He was starting to come around. "Bill?" I said, wincing as I moved to check on him. "Bill, can you hear me?" His eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then widening as he took in our surroundings. "Greg, what? Where are we?" I gave him a quick rundown of what had happened since he'd lost consciousness. As I spoke, I could see the disbelief in his eyes slowly turn to grim acceptance. "We need to get out of here," he said, trying to sit up. "Need to get to town, get help." I nodded, but the movement sent a wave of dizziness through me. The blood loss from my injuries was starting to take its toll. "I don't know if I can make it, Bill," I admitted. "I'm pretty messed up." Bill's face set in a determined expression. "We ain't giving up now, son. We've come too far." He tore strips from his shirt, using them to bind my wounds as best he could. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. As Bill worked, we listened to the sounds outside our shelter. The Bigfoot's roars had faded, but we could still hear it moving around, its heavy footsteps circling our hideout. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Bill finished tying off the last makeshift bandage and sat back, his face grim. "We wait," he said. "That thing can't stay out there forever. When it leaves, we make a run for it." I nodded, though the thought of going back out there filled me with dread. But we had no choice. We couldn't stay in this cave indefinitely, and I needed medical attention soon. As the hours crawled by, we took turns keeping watch at the narrow entrance of our shelter. The Bigfoot would disappear for stretches of time, only to return suddenly, testing the boulders, searching for a way to reach us. My condition worsened as time passed. Fever set in, and the cave seemed to spin around me. Bill looked at me with increasing concern, but there was nothing more he could do with our limited supplies. As the light outside began to fade, signaling the approach of another night in this nightmare, Bill turned to me with a grim expression. "Listen, Greg," he said softly. "That thing out there, it ain't natural. It ain't following any rules we understand. But it's smart and it's patient. It knows we have to come out eventually." I nodded weakly, understanding what he was getting at. "So what's the plan?" Bill's eyes hardened with determination. "We can't both make it out of here. You're in no condition to run, so here's what we're gonna do." As he laid out his plan, I felt a mix of gratitude and horror. It was risky, potentially suicidal, but it was also our only chance. As night fell and the forest came alive with unfamiliar sounds, we prepared ourselves for what was to come. One way or another, our encounter with the Bigfoot would end tonight. I just prayed we'd both live to tell the tale. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room made me wince as I slowly regained consciousness. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was or how I'd gotten there. Then it all came flooding back. The forest, the chase, the cave, Bill's desperate plan. Bill. Where was Bill? I tried to sit up, but a sharp pain in my chest forced me back down. Looking down, I saw my torso was wrapped in bandages, An IV drip was attached to my arm, and various monitors beeped steadily beside the bed. "Whoa there, take it easy," a voice said. I turned to see a nurse entering the room. "You've been through quite an ordeal." "Where am I?" I croaked, my throat dry and scratchy. "How did I get here?" The nurse handed me a cup of water. "You're in Glenwood Springs Hospital. A couple of hikers found you unconscious on a trail yesterday evening. You were in pretty bad shape. Severe lacerations, dehydration, exhaustion. You're lucky to be alive." As I sipped the water, my mind raced. Hikers? That wasn't right. Bill had. But before I could voice my confusion, a doctor entered the room, followed by two men in sheriff's uniforms. "Mr. Mitchell," the doctor said, consulting a chart. "I'm Dr. Ramirez. How are you feeling?" I'm not sure," I replied honestly. "Everything's a bit fuzzy. Where's Bill?" "The man I was with." The doctor and the officers exchanged glances. "Mr. Mitchell," one of the officers said, stepping forward. "I'm Sheriff Thompson. We were hoping you could tell us what happened out there. The hikers who found you said you were rambling about some kind of monster." I took a deep breath, wincing at the pain in my chest. It wasn't rambling. It was real. We were attacked by a Bigfoot. The room fell silent. I could see the disbelief growing in their eyes, their expressions shifting from concern to barely concealed skepticism. "A Bigfoot," the sheriff repeated flatly. "Mr. Mitchell, you've been through a traumatic experience. It's not uncommon for the mind to create explanations." "I'm not crazy," I insisted, my voice rising. "It was real. It chased us, attacked us. Bill can confirm everything." "Where is he?" Again, that uncomfortable exchange of glances. Dr. Ramirez cleared his throat. "Mr. Mitchell, we haven't found anyone else. The search and rescue team scoured the area where you were found. There was no sign of another person." My heart sank. "That's impossible. He was with me. He distracted the creature so I could escape. He saved my life." The sheriff sighed, pulling out a notepad. "Why don't you start from the beginning? Tell us everything that happened." And so I did. I told them about my camping trip, the footprints around my tent, the chase through the forest. I described the Bigfoot in vivid detail. Its massive size, its inhuman strength, the intelligence in its eyes. I told them about meeting Bill, our escape in his truck, and our final desperate plan in the cave. As I spoke, I could see the disbelief growing in their eyes. The doctor kept glancing at the monitors, as if checking to see if I was delirious. The sheriff wrote in his notepad, his expression unreadable. When I finished, there was a long, uncomfortable silence. "Mr. Mitchell," the sheriff finally said, his voice gentle but firm, "I understand you believe what you're saying, but you have to understand how this sounds. Bigfoot isn't real. It's a myth, a legend." "But the injuries," I protested. "How do you explain these?" I gestured to my bandaged chest. Dr. Ramirez stepped in. "Your injuries are consistent with a bear attack. Given the state we found you in, dehydrated, exhausted, possibly concussed, it's not surprising that your mind might have embellished the experience." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "A bear? Are you kidding me? I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear." "Greg," the doctor said soothingly, "you've been through a traumatic experience. Your mind is trying to make sense of it, but there's no evidence of any creature out there. No tracks, no hair samples, nothing." "What about Bill's truck?" I asked desperately. "It was wrecked when we crossed the stream. That has to still be there." The sheriff shook his head. "We found no vehicle matching that description. Are you sure you didn't imagine this Bill person?" I felt like I was going crazy. How could they not believe me? How could there be no evidence? "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I know how this sounds, but I'm telling you the truth. That thing is out there. It's dangerous. People need to know." The sheriff closed his notepad with a sigh. "Mr. Mitchell, we'll continue to investigate, of course, but right now the most important thing is for you to rest and recover." As they left the room, I could hear them talking in low voices outside the door. Words like delusion and psychological evaluation drifted in, making my heart sink even further. Over the next few days, my story spread. The local news ran a piece about the delusional camper who claimed to have been attacked by Bigfoot. Social media exploded with mocking memes and jokes at my expense. Doctors and psychologists came to evaluate me, each one more skeptical than the last. They talked about trauma-induced hallucinations, the power of suggestion, the mind's ability to create false memories. But I knew what I had seen, what I had experienced. It was real, all of it. As I lay in the hospital bed, staring out the window at the distant mountains, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, the creature was still roaming free. And Bill. What had happened to Bill? The doctors told me I was lucky to be alive, that my injuries could have been fatal if I hadn't been found when I was. But as I listened to them dismiss my story, watched the news mock my experience, I didn't feel lucky. I felt alone, frustrated, and more than a little scared. Because I knew the truth. The Bigfoot was real. It was out there. And no one believed me. As I was discharged from the hospital, my body healing but my mind still reeling from the ordeal, I realized with growing despair that this was my new reality. I would have to live with the knowledge of what I'd seen, what I'd experienced, while the rest of the world laughed it off as a delusion. But deep down, I knew. And I couldn't shake the feeling that someday, somehow, the truth would come out. I just hoped it wouldn't take another tragedy for people to finally believe. The morning after my discharge from the hospital, I found myself standing at the edge of the forest, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. The doctors had advised against any strenuous activity, but I couldn't shake the desperate need to find evidence, to prove that I wasn't crazy. "You don't have to do this, Greg," my sister Sarah said, concern etched on her face. She had driven up from Denver as soon as she heard about my accident. I turned to her, seeing the worry in her eyes. "I have to, Sarah. No one believes me. I need to find something, anything, to prove what happened." She sighed, clearly unconvinced. "And what if that thing is still out there?" I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the fear that threatened to overwhelm me. "It's broad daylight, and we're not going far from the road. I just need to check the area where I was found." Sarah nodded reluctantly. "Okay, but we stay together and we leave at the first sign of trouble. Promise me, Greg." "I promise," I said, grateful for her support, even if she didn't fully believe my story. We set off into the woods, following the trail where the hikers had reportedly found me. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. My eyes darted constantly, scanning for any sign of movement. "So, what exactly are we looking for?" Sarah asked as we picked our way through the underbrush. "Footprints, hair samples, broken branches. Anything that could prove something large was here," I replied, my eyes fixed on the ground. We searched for hours, combing through the area where I was found and expanding outward. But as the sun climbed higher in the sky, my hope began to fade. There were no massive footprints, no inexplicable claw marks on the trees. The forest looked normal. "Greg," Sarah said gently, placing a hand on my shoulder, "maybe we should head back. You're looking pale." I shook my head, frustration building. "Just a little longer. It has to be here somewhere." As if to mock my determination, a group of hikers passed by, their cheerful chatter a stark contrast to my grim mood. One of them recognized me from the news reports. "Hey, aren't you the Bigfoot guy?" he called out, a hint of amusement in his voice. I ignored him, but I could feel their stares, hear their poorly concealed laughter as they moved on. Sarah squeezed my arm supportively. Just when I was about to give up, I spotted something that made my heart race. a tuft of reddish-brown fur caught on a low-hanging branch. "There," I exclaimed, rushing over to it. "This has to be from the creature." Sarah followed, looking skeptical. "Greg, that could be from anything. A deer, a bear." But I wasn't listening. I carefully removed the fur from the branch, my hands shaking with excitement. "We need to get this analyzed. This could be the proof we need." As I turned to show Sarah, my foot caught on a root. I stumbled, and the precious tuft of fur slipped from my grasp, carried away by a sudden gust of wind. "No!" I cried, lunging for it. But it was gone, disappearing into the forest canopy. I sank to my knees, a wave of despair washing over me. Sarah knelt beside me, her arm around my shoulders. "I'm sorry, Greg," she said softly. "I know how much this means to you." I nodded, too disheartened to speak. As we sat there, the forest seemed to mock me with its peaceful beauty. Birds chirped, squirrels chattered, the wind rustled through the leaves. There was no sign of the terror I had experienced, no evidence of the monster that had hunted me. After a few minutes, I stood up, wincing at the pain in my chest. "Let's check the stream," I said, a last desperate hope in my voice. "That's where Bill and I crossed in the truck. There has to be some sign of it." Sarah looked like she wanted to object, but she nodded, helping me to my feet. We made our way to the stream I remembered from that terrifying chase. The water burbled peacefully over smooth stones, giving no hint of the chaos that had unfolded here. I waded into the stream, ignoring Sarah's protests about my injuries. My eyes scanned the banks, the surrounding trees, looking for any sign of our desperate crossing. But there was nothing. No tire tracks, no broken branches, no debris from the damaged truck. "I don't understand," I muttered, more to myself than to Sarah. "It was right here. How can there be no trace?" Sarah waded in after me, gently taking my arm. "Greg, please. You're going to hurt yourself. We should go." I wanted to argue, to keep searching, but I was exhausted, my chest aching from the exertion. With a heavy heart, I allowed Sarah to lead me back to shore. As we walked back towards the road, I couldn't shake the feeling of defeat. Everything I'd experienced, everything I'd seen, it was as if the forest had swallowed it all, leaving no trace behind. "I'm not crazy, Sarah," I said as we reached her car. "I know what I saw, what I experienced. It was real." Sarah's expression was a mixture of concern and pity. "I believe that you believe it, Greg. But maybe the doctors are right. Maybe your mind created this to cope with the trauma." I shook my head vehemently. "No, I know the difference between reality and imagination. This happened." As we drove away from the forest, I stared out the window, my mind racing. How could there be no evidence? How could something so massive, so terrifying, vanish without a trace? But deep down, I knew the truth. The Bigfoot was out there, somewhere in those woods. And even if no one else believed me, I would never forget the terror of our encounter. As the trees receded in the rearview mirror, I made a silent vow. I would find a way to prove what happened. Somehow, someday, I would make people believe, but for now, all I had were my memories and the scars on my body, silent testaments to a truth the world wasn't ready to accept. It's been 3 weeks since my encounter with the Bigfoot, and I still wake up screaming most nights. The doctors call it PTSD, but how can you treat a trauma that no one believes actually happened? I'm back in my apartment in Denver now, trying to piece my life back together. But it's not easy. Every shadow makes me jump. Every unexpected sound sends my heart racing. I find myself constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that massive, hair-covered form looming behind me. This morning, like most mornings since I've been back, I woke up in a cold sweat, the Bigfoot's roar echoing in my ears. As I stumbled to the bathroom, I caught sight of my reflection in the mirror. The physical scars were healing, but the haunted look in my eyes told a different story. My phone buzzed with a text from my sister, Sarah. "How are you feeling today? Don't forget your therapy appointment at 2. I sighed, typing out a quick response. "I'm fine, and I didn't forget." But I wasn't fine, not even close. As I made my morning coffee, my gaze drifted to the window. From my 15th floor apartment, I could see the distant mountains on the horizon. Somewhere out there, in those forests, the creature was still roaming free. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. My laptop sat open on the kitchen counter, dozens of tabs open to various Bigfoot forums and cryptozoology websites. I'd spent countless hours scouring these sites, desperate for validation, for someone who might believe my story. But all I'd found was more ridicule and disbelief. The coffee machine beeped, jolting me out of my thoughts. As I poured myself a cup, my hand shook slightly, spilling a few drops on the counter. It was a small thing, but it was a constant reminder of how much that encounter had affected me. At 1:30, I reluctantly got ready for my therapy appointment. Dr. Larson was well-meaning, but I could see the skepticism in her eyes every time I talked about what had happened. Still, I went. If nothing else, it gave me someone to talk to who was obligated to listen. As I walked to her office, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Logically, I knew the Bigfoot wasn't here in downtown Denver, but try telling that to my frayed nerves. "Greg," Dr. Larson greeted me with a warm smile as I entered her office. "How are you feeling today?" I settled into the now familiar leather chair across from her. "About the same," I replied, my voice flat. She nodded, making a note on her pad. "Any more nightmares?" I let out a humorless laugh. "Every night, always the same. I'm back in that forest, running for my life. I can hear it behind me getting closer. I wake up just as it's about to grab me." Dr. Larson leaned forward, her expression sympathetic. "Greg, we've talked about this. These nightmares, they're your mind's way of processing the trauma you experienced. But remember, the bear attack—" "It wasn't a bear," I interrupted, my voice rising. "I've told you 100 times. It was Bigfoot." "I know what I saw," she sighed, setting down her notepad. "Greg, I understand that you believe what you're saying, but you have to consider the possibility that your mind created this creature to cope with a traumatic event. It's not uncommon for the brain to fill in gaps in memory with fantastical elements." I stood up, pacing the room. "You don't understand. None of you do. I'm not crazy. I'm not making this up. It was real." "No one's saying you're crazy, Greg," Dr. Larson said soothingly. "But consider the facts. There's no evidence of this creature. No one else has seen it. Don't you think it's possible that—" "That what?" I snapped. "That I imagined the whole thing? That I clawed my own chest open? That I invented Bill out of thin air?" Dr. Larson remained calm in the face of my outburst. "I'm simply asking you to consider other possibilities. Your mind has been through a significant trauma. It's trying to make sense of what happened." I sank back into the chair, suddenly exhausted. "I know what I saw," I said quietly. "I know what happened. Why won't anyone believe me?" The rest of the session passed in a blur. Dr. Larson talked about coping mechanisms, about the importance of getting back to a normal routine. But her words washed over me, barely registering. As I left her office, I felt more alone than ever. Even the people who were supposed to help me thought I was delusional. Back in my apartment, I found myself once again drawn to the window, staring out at the distant mountains. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. It was beautiful, but all I could think about was how quickly beauty could turn to terror. My phone buzzed with another text from Sarah. "How did the appointment go?" I ignored it, instead opening my laptop. Almost without thinking, I found myself on a Bigfoot conspiracy forum. I'd been lurking here for days, reading stories from other alleged encounters. Most were clearly fake, but a few rang true. Before I could stop myself, I started typing out my story. Everything that had happened, from the footprints around my campsite to the final desperate chase through the forest. As I wrote, it all came flooding back. The terror, the disbelief, the sheer impossibility of what I'd experienced. I hit post before I could second-guess myself. Within minutes, the responses started rolling in. Most were skeptical, some outright mocking, but a A few seemed to believe me. I had a similar experience in Yellowstone, one user wrote. No one believed me either. The government is covering up the existence of these creatures, another claimed. They don't want us to know the truth. As I read through the responses, I felt a mix of validation and frustration. These people believed me, but they were exactly the type that made it so hard for anyone to take Bigfoot sightings seriously. A notification popped up on my screen, a private message from a user named CryptoHunter42. I believe you, the message read. I've been tracking Bigfoot activity in Colorado for years. We should talk. My cursor hovered over the reply button. Part of me wanted to respond, to connect with someone who might actually believe my story. But another part, the part that still woke up screaming every night, hesitated. Did I really want to dive deeper into this? To relive that terror? To potentially put myself in danger again? As I sat there staring at the screen, I realized that this was a turning point. I could try to move on, to forget what had happened and live a normal life. Or I could pursue the truth no matter where it led me. The choice I made in that moment would shape the rest of my life. As I looked out once more at the distant mountains, I knew that somewhere out there, the Bigfoot was still roaming free, and I was the only one who knew the truth. With a deep breath, I turned back to my computer and began to type my response. Whatever came next, I knew one thing for certain. My life would never be the same again. The morning sun barely penetrated the thick canopy as I stepped onto the trailhead of the Redwood National Park. I, Laura Smith, had been planning this solo hiking trip for months, eager to escape the chaos of San Francisco and immerse myself in nature's embrace. Little did I know that this journey would forever change my life. As I adjusted my backpack straps, a park ranger approached me with a friendly smile. "Heading out for a hike, ma'am?" he asked, his eyes scanning my gear. "Yes, I'm planning to do the Tall Trees Grove Trail," I replied, double-checking my map. The ranger's expression turned serious. "Be careful out there. We've had some strange reports lately. Probably just some bear activity, but stay alert." I nodded, only half listening. I was an experienced hiker. I knew how to handle myself in the wilderness. "Thanks, I'll keep an eye out," I said, eager to start my adventure. As I stepped onto the trail, the dense Northern California forest seemed to swallow me whole. The towering redwoods stretched endlessly upward, their massive trunks creating a natural labyrinth. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine, a welcome change from the city's pollution. For the first few hours, I reveled in the solitude. The only sounds were my boots crunching on the forest floor and the occasional bird call echoing through the trees. But as the day wore on, an unsettling feeling began to creep over me. The eerie silence of the woods made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I tried to shake off the feeling, chalking it up to my imagination running wild in the unfamiliar surroundings. "Get a grip, Laura," I muttered to myself, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow in the quiet forest. As I pushed deeper into the wilderness, the trail became less defined. I found myself checking my map and compass more frequently, the dense undergrowth making it difficult to navigate. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees in dappled patterns, creating shifting shadows that played tricks on my eyes. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig sent a jolt of adrenaline through my body. I tried to rationalize it. Probably just a deer or a raccoon, I told myself. But a nagging voice in the back of my mind whispered that it was something else entirely. Taking a deep breath, I paused to drink some water and check my bearings. That's when I heard it. A twig snapping behind me. I spun around, my heart racing, but saw nothing. The forest stretched out before me, silent and still. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and insignificant among the towering trees. No response came, save for the echo of my own words. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone to check the time. To my dismay, there was no signal. I was truly alone out here. As I continued my hike, the feeling of unease grew stronger. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees looming larger and more menacing with each step. I found myself jumping at every sound, my imagination conjuring terrifying scenarios. Just a few more miles, I reassured myself, checking my map again. Then you'll reach the campsite and everything will be fine. But as the afternoon wore on and shadows lengthened, I realized with growing panic that I had somehow strayed from the marked trail. The landmarks on my map no longer matched what I was seeing. I was lost. Trying to quell my rising fear, I decided to backtrack, hoping to find a familiar marker. But as I retraced my steps, nothing looked familiar. It was as if the forest itself had shifted, rearranging itself to confuse and disorient me. As night began to fall, the forest transformed into a labyrinth of darkness and whispers. The friendly woods of the daytime morphed into a sinister alien landscape. Shadows danced at the edge of my vision, and every sound seemed amplified in the growing darkness. I fumbled in my pack for my flashlight, my hands trembling so badly I could barely switch it on. The narrow beam did little to penetrate the oppressive darkness, instead creating grotesque shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. "Stay calm," I whispered to myself, my voice quavering. "Just find a safe spot to set up camp for the night. Everything will look better in the morning." But as I searched for a suitable clearing, a sound stopped me dead in my tracks. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't a bear or a mountain lion or any animal I could identify. It was something other. My breath caught in my throat as I swung my flashlight wildly, trying to locate the source of the sound. The beam caught a flash of movement in the underbrush, something large, much larger than any animal that should be in these woods. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking with fear. "This isn't funny." But deep down, I knew this was no prank. The primal part of my brain was screaming at me to run, to hide, to do anything to escape the unseen threat that lurked in the darkness. I backed away slowly, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow. Every tree seemed to hide a potential threat. Every rustle of leaves a harbinger of doom. The growl came again, closer this time, and I couldn't suppress a whimper of terror. That's when I saw them, a pair of eyes reflecting the beam of my flashlight. They were set too high to be a bear or a mountain lion, and they gleamed with an intelligence that sent chills down my spine. For a brief moment our gazes locked, and I felt the weight of an ancient primal hunger bearing down on me. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the creature vanished into the underbrush. The sound of its passage through the forest, the snapping of branches and the rustle of leaves, told me it was circling around, hunting me. With a strangled cry, I turned and ran blindly into the night. Branches whipped at my face and arms as I crashed through the underbrush, my only thought to put as much distance as possible between myself and the monster that pursued me. As I fled deeper into the unknown wilderness, one thought echoed in my mind. This was only the beginning of my nightmare. The real terror was yet to come. My lungs burned as I ran through the pitch-black forest, branches whipping my face and arms. I don't know how long I fled, driven by pure adrenaline and terror. Eventually, my legs gave out, and I collapsed against the base of a massive redwood, gasping for air. As my breathing slowly steadied, I became acutely aware of the oppressive silence that had fallen over the forest. No crickets chirped, no owls hooted. It was as if the entire woodland held its breath, waiting. I fumbled for my flashlight, which I'd somehow managed to hold on to during my frantic escape. Its beam seemed feeble against the vast darkness, but it was my only lifeline. My hands shook as I tried to get my bearings, but nothing looked familiar. I was hopelessly lost. "Think, Laura. Think," I muttered to myself, trying to recall my wilderness survival training. "Stay put. Don't wander. Wait for daylight." But the memory of those eyes gleaming in the darkness made my skin crawl. Could I really stay here, exposed and vulnerable? That's when I heard it, a guttural growl that echoed through the trees, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't the roar of a bear or the snarl of a mountain lion. This sound was deeper, almost primeval, and it froze the blood in my veins. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is someone there?" Silence answered me, broken only by the pounding of my heart. Then, another sound reached my ears, the snap and crunch of heavy footsteps moving through the underbrush. Whatever was out there, it was big, and it was getting closer. I swung my flashlight wildly, trying to catch a glimpse of my stalker. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating trees and shadows until suddenly, "Oh my God," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The light had fallen on a set of footprints in a patch of mud. But these weren't the tracks of any animal I recognized. They were enormous, easily twice the size of my own foot with 5 distinct toes. And they were fresh. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. This couldn't be real. It had to be a hoax, a prank. But deep down I knew no human could have made those prints. The growl came again, closer this time, snapping me out of my shocked stupor. I had to move, now. I scrambled to my feet and started running again, no destination in mind except away from whatever was hunting me. The forest was a blur of shadows and branches as I crashed through the undergrowth. Suddenly the ground disappeared beneath my feet. I tumbled down a steep embankment, leaves and twigs scratching my skin as I rolled. When I finally came to a stop, I found myself in a small clearing, the canopy opening up to reveal a sky full of stars. For a moment I lay there dazed and winded. Then I heard it. Heavy breathing, just feet away from where I had fallen. Slowly, terrified of what I might see, I raised my head. And there it was. Standing at the edge of the clearing was a creature straight out of a nightmare. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, covered in thick, matted fur. Its arms were long, almost reaching its knees, ending in hands with wickedly curved claws. But it was the face that would haunt me forever, a blend of ape and man with a sloped forehead and a powerful jaw. And those eyes, glowing with an intelligence that was anything but human. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I could only stare in horror as the creature, the Bigfoot, took a step toward me. "This isn't real," I whispered, squeezing my eyes shut. "This can't be happening." But when I opened them again, it was still there, and it was angry. The Bigfoot let out a roar that shook the very air around us. I scrambled backward, leaves and twigs digging into my palms as I tried to put distance between myself and the monster. "Please," I begged, though I knew it was futile. This wasn't a creature capable of mercy or understanding. This was a predator, and I was its prey. As if to confirm my thoughts, the Bigfoot charged. I rolled to the side just as its massive hand swung down, barely missing my head and leaving deep gouges in the earth where I had been lying. I stumbled to my feet and ran, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for direction or stealth. Behind me, I could hear the creature pursuing, its heavy footfalls shaking the ground. I caught a glimpse of something enormous moving through the underbrush, too fast to be human. It was toying with me, I realized with growing horror. It could have caught me at any time, but it was drawing out the chase, savoring my fear. The stench hit me then, a nauseating mix of wet fur, decay, and something else, something alien and musky. It was so strong it made me gag, and I knew the creature was right behind me. Desperate, I veered sharply to the right, hoping to throw it off. But my foot caught on a root, and I went down hard, the air driven from my lungs as I hit the forest floor. Gasping, I rolled onto my back, fumbling for my flashlight. As the beam cut through the darkness, I saw the Bigfoot standing over me, its eyes full of rage. For a moment, time seemed to stand still as we locked gazes. Then, with a final, ear-splitting roar, it disappeared into the trees, leaving me alone in the darkness. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, listening to its roars echoing through the night. My mind struggled to process what had just happened. This couldn't be real. Bigfoot was a myth, a legend. It didn't exist. But the ache in my muscles, the scratches on my skin, and the lingering stench in the air told a different story. This was real, and I was living a nightmare. As the adrenaline began to wear off, I became aware of every sound in the forest. Every snapping twig, Every rustling leaf could be the creature returning to finish what it had started. I knew I couldn't stay here. The Bigfoot was still out there, and I had no doubt it would come back. But in the pitch darkness, with no idea where I was or which direction led to safety, moving seemed just as dangerous as staying put. With shaking hands, I reached for my backpack, which had somehow stayed with me through the chase. I needed water, food, anything to help me think clearly and figure out my next move. As I rummaged through my pack, my hand closed around my map and compass. A spark of hope flickered in my chest. If I could just figure out where I was, maybe I could find my way back to the trail, back to civilization. But as I unfolded the map, a horrifying realization dawned on me. In the chaos of the chase, I had no idea how far I'd run or in what direction. I was completely and utterly lost. The weight of my situation crashed down on me. I was alone in a vast wilderness, being hunted by a creature that shouldn't exist, with no idea how to get to safety. And the night was far from over. As if to emphasize my predicament, a distant roar echoed through the trees. The Bigfoot was still out there, and I knew with chilling certainty that our encounter was far from over. The real terror was just beginning. With no other choice, I pushed myself to my feet, picked a direction, and started walking. Each step was an act of will, fighting against the urge to curl up and give in to despair. But I had to keep moving. I had to survive. As I ventured deeper into the unknown, one thought kept repeating in my mind. This was only the beginning of my ordeal. The true test of survival lay ahead, in the long, dark hours before dawn. The forest seemed to close in around me as I stumbled through the darkness. Every shadow concealed a potential threat, every sound a harbinger of doom. My flashlight, once a beacon of hope, now felt like a target on my back, announcing my presence to the creature that hunted me. I don't know how long I walked, time losing all meaning in the endless night. My body ached, cuts and bruises from my earlier falls making themselves known with each step. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't rest. Not with that thing out there. As I pushed through a dense patch of undergrowth, my foot caught on something, sending me sprawling to the ground. I lay there for a moment, exhaustion threatening to overwhelm me. "Get up, Laura," I muttered to myself, my voice hoarse and unfamiliar. "You can't stay here." With a groan, I pushed myself to my knees, reaching for my fallen flashlight. As I did, my hand brushed against something soft and damp. Frowning, I directed the beam towards it. My scream echoed through the forest as I scrambled backward. There, half hidden by leaves, was the mangled carcass of a deer. Its body was torn open, ribs exposed to the night air. But it wasn't the gore that sent ice through my veins. It was the massive humanoid handprint pressed into the bloody fur. Before I could process what I was seeing, a deafening roar split the air. It was close. Too close. Panic overrode exhaustion as I lurched to my feet and ran. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me at every step. But I didn't slow down. I couldn't. The sound of something massive crashing through the forest behind me spurred me on. "Help!" I screamed, knowing it was futile but unable to stop myself. "Somebody, please." My plea was cut short as a monstrous hand burst through the foliage, barely missing my face. I caught a glimpse of matted fur and curved claws before I changed direction, ducking under a low-hanging branch. The creature roared in frustration, the sound so loud and close it made my ears ring. I could hear it pursuing me, its heavy footfalls shaking the ground. It was toying with me, I realized with growing horror. It could have caught me at any time, but it was drawing out the chase, savoring my terror. I ran blindly through the forest, branches whipping my skin as I heard it crashing behind me. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but I couldn't stop. To stop was to die. "This isn't happening," I gasped between ragged breaths. "This can't be real." But the hot breath I felt on the back of my neck was all too real. The creature was right behind me, so close I could smell its foul odor. A mixture of wet fur, rotting meat, and something alien and musky. In my panic, I didn't see the steep slope ahead until it was too late. My foot met empty air and suddenly I was falling. The world spun around me as I tumbled down the ravine, pain shooting through my body with each impact. When I finally came to a stop at the bottom, every part of me hurt. I lay there, dazed and winded, staring up at the canopy of trees above. For a moment, all was quiet. Then, a shadow fell over me. Slowly, dreading what I would see, I turned my head. There it stood, a nightmare made flesh. The Bigfoot towered over me, its massive form blocking out what little moonlight filtered through the trees. Its eyes, glowing with an unnatural intelligence, were fixed on me with an intensity that froze the breath in my lungs. I saw Bigfoot standing over me, its eyes full of rage before it disappeared into the trees. But this time it didn't vanish. This time it stayed, its massive chest heaving with each breath, clawed hands flexing at its sides. "Please," I whimpered, though I knew it was useless. This wasn't a creature capable of mercy or understanding. This was a predator, and I was its prey. As if triggered by my plea, the Bigfoot let out an ear-splitting roar and lunged forward. I rolled to the side, feeling the rush of air as its massive fist struck the ground where my head had been moments before. Adrenaline surged through me, momentarily masking the pain of my injuries. I scrambled to my feet and ran, no destination in mind except away from the monster behind me. But I was tired, injured, and in unfamiliar territory. The Bigfoot, on the other hand, was in its element. I could hear it crashing through the underbrush behind me, gaining ground with each passing second. Suddenly, my foot caught on an exposed root, and I went down hard. Pain exploded in my ankle as I hit the forest floor. I tried to get up, but my leg buckled under me. "No, no, no," I sobbed, dragging myself forward with my arms. But it was no use. A massive hand closed around my leg, and I screamed as I felt myself being dragged backward. The Bigfoot flipped me over, and I found myself staring up into its terrifying face. Up close, the creature was even more horrifying. Its face was a nightmarish blend of ape and man, with a sloped forehead, a powerful jaw, and eyes that glowed with malevolent intelligence. Saliva dripped from yellowed fangs as it opened its mouth and roared. I felt its claws rip into my flesh as I desperately fought to break free. The pain was excruciating, but the fear was worse. I knew with chilling certainty that I was about to die. "Help!" I screamed, my voice raw and desperate. "Someone, please!" But there was no one to hear me, no one to save me. I was alone with this monster, miles from civilization. The Bigfoot's foul breath washed over me as its face came inches from mine, teeth bared. I could see my terrified reflection in its eyes, could feel the heat radiating from its massive body. Time seemed to slow down. In that moment, I thought of my family, my friends, the life I'd left behind in San Francisco. Would anyone ever know what happened to me? Would my body ever be found? Or would I simply become another mysterious disappearance in these vast woods? Just as I was sure the creature was about to deliver the killing blow, something changed. Its head snapped up, nostrils flaring as if catching a scent on the wind. For a moment, it seemed almost uncertain. Then, with a final ear-splitting roar, it suddenly released me and vanished into the forest. The sound of its passage, snapping branches and rustling leaves, quickly faded, leaving me alone in the eerie silence of the woods. I lay there, paralyzed with fear and pain, unable to believe I was still alive. Every part of me hurt, and I could feel warm blood seeping from the wounds where the creature's claws had torn into my skin. As the adrenaline began to fade, the full weight of what had just happened crashed down on me. I had come face to face with a creature that shouldn't exist, had felt its breath on my skin, had looked into its eyes and seen my death reflected back at me. And yet somehow, I had survived. Slowly, painfully, I pushed myself into a sitting position. My ankle throbbed, and I knew without looking that it was badly sprained, if not broken. The cuts on my arms and legs stung in the cool night air. I needed help. I needed to get out of these woods. But how? I was lost, injured, and had no idea which direction would lead me to safety. And worst of all, I knew the Bigfoot was still out there. Its sudden departure didn't mean I was safe. If anything, it made me more nervous. What had it sensed that made it leave so abruptly? As if in answer to my unspoken question, a distant roar echoed through the trees. The sound sent a fresh wave of terror through me. The creature was still out there, and I had no doubt it would return to finish what it had started. With trembling hands, I reached for my backpack, which had somehow stayed with me through the attack. I needed to tend to my wounds, to try and gather my thoughts. But more than anything, I needed to find a way out of this nightmare. As I fumbled with the zipper of my first aid kit, I couldn't shake the feeling that this ordeal was far from over. The night was still young, and somewhere in these dark woods, a monster was waiting. My fight for survival had only just begun. The forest seemed to close in around me as I huddled against the rough bark of an ancient redwood. My hands shook as I fumbled with the first aid kit, trying to clean and bandage the worst of my wounds. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound a potential threat as I tended to my injuries. "Stay calm, Laura," I whispered to myself, wincing as I applied antiseptic to a particularly deep gash on my arm. "You've got to keep it together." But how could I stay calm? I had just been attacked by a creature that shouldn't exist. My mind reeled, trying to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was a bear, a particularly large mountain lion. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had seen Bigfoot with my own eyes, felt its breath on my face, its claws tearing into my flesh. As I finished bandaging my wounds, I took stock of my situation. My ankle was swollen and painful, likely sprained. Cuts and bruises covered my body, and my clothes were torn and bloodied. My backpack had survived the ordeal, but much of my food and water had been lost in the chase. I checked my phone again, desperate for a signal, but the screen remained stubbornly blank. I was truly alone out here. A distant roar echoed through the trees, sending a fresh wave of terror through me. The creature was still out there, hunting me. I couldn't stay here. Gritting my teeth against the pain, I pushed myself to my feet. My injured ankle protested, but I forced myself to take a step, then another. I had to keep moving. I limped through the darkness, jumping at every snapping twig and rustling leaf. The forest, once a place of wonder and adventure, had transformed into a nightmarish labyrinth. Every tree could be hiding the monster, every shadow concealing its massive form. As I stumbled along, I tried to make sense of what was happening. "This can't be real," I muttered, my voice sounding small and scared in the vast silence of the woods. "Bigfoot isn't real. It's just a legend, a myth." But the pain in my body and the terror in my heart told a different story. This was all too real, and I was living it. Hours seemed to pass as I made my way through the forest. My progress was slow, hampered by my injuries and the constant need to stay alert for any sign of the creature. Every sound made me flinch, convinced the monster was coming back to finish me off. As the night wore on, exhaustion began to set in. My limbs felt heavy, and my thoughts became sluggish. I knew I needed to rest, but the fear of being caught defenseless kept me moving. Suddenly, a low growl cut through the night air. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It was close, too close. I scanned the darkness frantically, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then a flicker of movement caught my eye. Something large was moving through the underbrush, circling around me. "No, no, no," I whimpered, backing away slowly. My injured ankle gave way and I fell hard, leaves and twigs crunching beneath me. As I scrambled to my feet, I caught a glimpse of a massive, fur-covered form moving between the trees. The creature's howls grew closer, and I knew it was toying with me, like a cat with a mouse. Panic overrode pain and exhaustion. I ran, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for direction or stealth. Branches whipped at my face. Roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't slow down. I couldn't. The sound of heavy footfalls behind me spurred me on. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning in the endless night. But eventually my body gave out. I collapsed against a tree, gasping for air, my legs trembling with exertion. As I fought to catch my breath, I realized the sounds of pursuit had faded. Had I lost it? Or was it still out there, waiting, watching? I scanned my surroundings, desperate for any sign of safety. That's when I saw it, a small opening in the rocky hillside nearby. A cave. Hope surged through me. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. Somewhere I could hide, catch my breath, maybe even rest for a moment. I limped towards the cave entrance, every step in agony. As I reached the opening, I paused, shining my flashlight into the darkness. The beam revealed a small, shallow cavern. It wasn't deep, but it was enough. I crawled inside, wincing as the rough stone scraped against my injuries. The cave was cramped and damp, but in that moment it felt like the safest place in the world. Exhaustion washed over me as the adrenaline began to fade. I wanted nothing more than to close my eyes and sleep, but fear kept me awake. What if the creature found me here? What if I woke up to find those terrifying eyes staring at me in the darkness? I huddled at the back of the cave, my flashlight clutched to my chest like a lifeline. Every sound from the forest outside made me flinch. The rustle of leaves, the hoot of an owl, the snap of a twig. As the hours crawled by, my mind began to play tricks on me. Shadows at the cave entrance seemed to move, taking on monstrous shapes. More than once, I was certain I saw glowing eyes peering at me from the darkness, only for them to vanish when I blinked. "It's not real," I whispered to myself, rocking back and forth. "You're just tired. It's not real." But the memory of the creature's roar, the feel of its claws tearing into my flesh was all too real. This was no nightmare I could wake up from. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky, I allowed myself to relax slightly. I had survived the night. Maybe, just maybe, I would make it out of this alive. Cautiously, I crawled to the cave entrance and peered out. The forest was quiet, peaceful in the early morning light. For a moment, I almost convinced myself that the events of the night had been a terrible dream. Then I saw them. Fresh, massive footprints circling my hiding spot. My blood ran cold as I realized the truth. The creature had found me. It had been right outside the cave, watching, waiting. Why hadn't it attacked? What was it waiting for? The questions swirled in my mind, each more terrifying than the last. As I stared at the footprints, a chilling certainty settled over me. This wasn't over. The creature was still out there, and it wasn't done with me yet. The night of terror might have ended, but my ordeal was far from over. With trembling hands, I gathered my meager supplies. I had to move, had to find help. But as I stepped out of the cave and into the morning light, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Somewhere in these vast woods, a monster was waiting. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that our final confrontation was yet to come. The morning sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. In any other circumstance, it might have been beautiful. But for me, Laura Smith, every patch of sunlight was just another place for a monster to hide. I limped through the woods, my body screaming in protest with every step. The night in the cave had done little to ease my injuries. If anything, the stiffness in my muscles and the throbbing pain in my ankle had intensified. But I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving, had to find my way out of this nightmare. As I pushed through a dense thicket, a twig snapped behind me. I spun around, my heart racing, but saw nothing. The forest stretched out before me, silent and still. Too still. "Hello?" I called out, my voice hoarse and trembling. "Is anyone there?" Silence answered me, broken only by the pounding of my heart. But deep down I knew. I wasn't alone. I turned to continue my journey, and that's when I saw it. There, not 20 feet away, stood the creature that had haunted my nightmares. Bigfoot. Its massive form blocked out the sun, casting me in its shadow. Time seemed to stand still as we stared at each other. Its eyes, intelligent and filled with an emotion I couldn't quite place, bore into mine. In that moment, I realized with chilling clarity that this wasn't just some animal. This was something else entirely. I heard the creature's heavy breathing behind me and turned to face my nightmare. Its massive form blocked out the sun as it lunged at me with incredible speed. I barely had time to react, diving to the side as its enormous hand swiped through the air where I had been standing. "No!" I screamed, scrambling backward on all fours. "Stay away from me!" But the creature was relentless. It advanced on me, each step shaking the ground. I could smell its musky animal odor, could see the saliva dripping from its fanged mouth. In desperation, I grabbed a fallen branch and swung it at the creature's face. It batted the makeshift weapon away as if it were nothing more than a twig, splintering it with ease. I turned to run, but my injured ankle gave way beneath me. I fell hard, the breath driven from my lungs as I hit the forest floor. Pain exploded through my body, and for a moment the world spun around me. When my vision cleared, I found myself staring up at the creature. It towered over me, its massive form silhouetted against the morning sky. I could see every detail of its face, the matted fur, the powerful jaw, the eyes that seemed to glow with an inner fire. I felt its claws rip into my flesh as I desperately fought to break free. The pain was excruciating, like nothing I had ever experienced before. I screamed, the sound echoing through the silent forest. "Help!" I cried out, knowing it was futile but unable to stop myself. "Someone, please!" But there was no one to hear me, no one to save me. I was alone with this monster, miles from civilization. The Bigfoot's foul breath washed over me as its face came inches from mine, teeth bared. I could see my terrified reflection in its eyes, could feel the heat radiating from its massive body. This was it, I thought. This was how I was going to die. In that moment, my life flashed before my eyes. I thought of my family, my friends, the life I had left behind in San Francisco. Would they ever know what happened to me? Would my body ever be found? Or would I simply become another mysterious disappearance in these vast woods? As the creature's jaws opened wide, I closed my eyes, bracing for the end. But it didn't come. Instead, I heard a strange sound, a mix between a growl and a whine. I opened my eyes to see the Bigfoot looking away, its ears pricked as if listening to something I couldn't hear. For a moment, hope flared in my chest. Maybe someone had heard my screams. Maybe help was coming. But then the creature's attention snapped back to me, and I saw something new in its eyes. Not just rage or hunger, but fear, confusion. Before I could process what I was seeing, it let out an ear-splitting roar that shook the very air around us. With a final terrifying display of strength, it lifted me off the ground. I felt myself flying through the air. Then pain exploded through my body as I crashed into a tree trunk. The world spun around me, darkness creeping at the edges of my vision. Through blurred eyes, I saw the creature turn and disappear into the forest. The sound of its passage, snapping branches and rustling leaves, quickly faded, leaving me alone in the eerie silence of the woods. I don't know how long I lay there, drifting in and out of consciousness. Every part of me hurt. I could feel warm blood seeping from the wounds where the creature's claws had torn into my skin. My clothes were in tatters, my body a canvas of cuts, bruises, and claw marks. As the adrenaline began to fade, the full weight of what had just happened crashed down on me. I had come face to face with a creature that shouldn't exist, had felt its breath on my skin, had looked into its eyes and seen my death reflected back at me. And yet somehow, I had survived. Slowly, painfully, I pushed myself into a sitting position, leaning against the tree that had broken my fall. My vision swam, and nausea rolled through me. I was pretty sure I had a concussion, on top of all my other injuries. I needed help. I needed to get out of these woods. But how? I was lost, badly injured, and had no idea which direction would lead me to safety. And worst of all, I knew the Bigfoot was still out there. Its sudden departure didn't mean I was safe. If anything, it made me more nervous. What had it sensed that made it leave so abruptly? As if in answer to my unspoken question, I heard something. Not the roar of the creature or the sounds of the forest, but something else. Something human. "Hello?" A distant voice called. "Is anyone out there?" For a moment I thought I was hallucinating, but then I heard it again, closer this time. "Help!" I screamed, my voice raw and weak. "I'm here. Please, help me." I heard shouts, the sound of people moving through the forest. Then, suddenly, a face appeared through the trees. A park ranger, his eyes widening as he took in my battered state. "Oh my God," he said, rushing to my side. "What happened to you?" As more rangers appeared, gathering around me with first aid kits and worried expressions, I tried to find the words to explain. But how could I describe what I had been through? How could I make them understand the terror of the past 24 hours? "It was—" I began, then stopped. I could see the skepticism in their eyes already. They wouldn't believe me. No one would. "It was a bear," I finally said, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. "A really big bear." As they began to treat my wounds and prepare me for evacuation, I couldn't shake the feeling that my ordeal wasn't truly over. The creature was still out there, somewhere in these vast woods. And while I had escaped with my life, I knew that the memory of this encounter would haunt me forever. As they lifted me onto a stretcher, I caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of the clearing. For a split second, I saw a pair of intelligent, inhuman eyes watching from the shadows. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. I closed my eyes as they carried me out of the forest, leaving behind the scene of my terrifying encounter. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that while I was leaving the woods, and the secrets they held, would never truly leave me. The rhythmic beeping of medical equipment filled my ears as I slowly regained consciousness. The stark white ceiling of a hospital room came into focus, a jarring contrast to the dark, menacing forest I had been trapped in for what felt like an eternity. I was safe now, or at least that's what I tried to tell myself. But the memory of those inhuman eyes watching me from the shadows as I was carried away lingered, sending a chill down my spine. I attempted to sit up, but a sharp pain shot through my body, reminding me of the ordeal I had endured. A nurse quickly appeared at my side, gently easing me back onto the pillow. "Easy there, Ms. Smith," she said softly. "You've been through quite an ordeal. Try not to move too much." I wanted to laugh at the understatement, but it came out as more of a pained groan. How long have I been here?" I managed to croak out, my throat dry and raw. "You were brought in yesterday afternoon," the nurse replied, checking my vitals. "You've been in and out of consciousness since then. The doctor will be in shortly to discuss your condition." Yesterday afternoon. Had it really only been a day since I was rescued from that nightmare? It felt like a lifetime ago. I closed my eyes, trying to piece together the fragmented memories of my escape from the forest. I remembered stumbling through the woods, delirious with pain and fear, desperate to find help. Every sound had made me flinch, convinced the monster was coming back to finish me off. The relief I felt when I finally heard human voices was overwhelming, but it was quickly replaced by a new kind of fear. How could I possibly explain what had happened to me? The memory of the park rangers' faces as they found me flashed through my mind, their expressions of shock and concern as they took in my battered state. I had opened my mouth to tell them about the creature, about Bigfoot, but the words had died in my throat. The skepticism in their eyes was clear even before I spoke. They wouldn't believe me. No one would. So I had lied. "A bear," I had told them, the false words tasting bitter on my tongue. It was a really big bear. I was pulled from my thoughts by the arrival of the doctor, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a reassuring smile. "Miss Smith," he greeted me, picking up my chart. "I'm Dr. Ramirez. How are you feeling?" "Like I've been hit by a truck," I replied honestly, wincing as I shifted in the bed. Dr. Ramirez nodded sympathetically. That's to be expected given what you've been through. You have multiple lacerations, some of which required stitches, a sprained ankle, 2 cracked ribs, and a mild concussion. You're also suffering from dehydration and exhaustion. But considering the circumstances, you're actually quite lucky. Lucky. The word echoed in my head. If only he knew. The park rangers who found you said you were attacked by a bear? Dr. Ramirez continued, his tone questioning. I swallowed hard, the lie sitting uncomfortably in my chest. But what choice did I have? Yes, I said, avoiding his gaze. A bear. It was huge. Dr. Ramirez made a note on my chart. Well, your injuries are consistent with an animal attack. You're very fortunate to have survived such an encounter. As the doctor continued to explain my treatment plan, my mind wandered back to the forest. I could still hear the creature's ear-splitting roar, still feel its hot breath on my face. The memory of its massive form looming over me, eyes gleaming with an unnatural intelligence, was seared into my brain. Mrs. Smith? Dr. Ramirez's voice pulled me back to the present. Are you all right? I realized I was shaking, my hands clutching the hospital blanket so tightly my knuckles had turned white. I'm fine, I lied, forcing a weak smile. Just tired. The doctor nodded, though I could see concern in his eyes. That's understandable. You've been through a traumatic experience. I'm going to recommend you speak with our hospital psychologist. PTSD is common in survivors of animal attacks. PTSD. The term seemed inadequate to describe the terror that still gripped me. How could I explain that my trauma wasn't just from an animal attack, but from an encounter with a creature that shouldn't exist? As Dr. Ramirez left, promising to check on me later, I was left alone with my thoughts. I closed my eyes, trying to find some peace, but all I could see was the forest. The shadows between the trees seemed to move, taking on monstrous shapes. I could hear the snap of twigs, the rustle of leaves, the heavy breathing of something large and inhuman. I jerked awake, my heart pounding. The hospital room came back into focus, but the fear lingered. I knew then that escaping the forest hadn't been the end of my ordeal. The real struggle was just beginning. The next few hours passed in a blur of medical tests, police interviews, and visits from well-meaning but clueless friends. Each time I recounted my story, sticking to the bear attack lie, I felt a piece of myself slip away. The truth burned inside me, desperate to be told, but I knew the consequences of speaking it aloud. As evening fell, I found myself alone in my hospital room, staring out the window at the city lights. They seemed so far away, so normal. How could the world just go on as if nothing had happened? As if there wasn't a monster lurking in the woods, defying everything we thought we knew about the natural world? A knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. A police officer entered, notepad in hand. Ms. Smith, I'm Officer Johnson. I hope you're feeling up to answering a few more questions about your attack. I nodded wearily, bracing myself for another round of lies. Can you describe the bear that attacked you? Officer Johnson asked, pen poised over his notepad. I hesitated, the truth on the tip of my tongue. But as I opened my mouth to speak, I caught sight of my reflection in the window. The woman staring back at me looked haunted, her eyes wide with a fear that went beyond a simple bear attack. It was big, I said finally, the words feeling hollow. Brown fur, sharp claws. It happened so fast I didn't get a good look. Officer Johnson nodded, jotting down my vague description. And you're sure it was a bear? Not a mountain lion or a wolf? For a moment, I considered telling him the truth. About the creature's massive humanoid form. About its intelligent eyes and the way it had toyed with me like a cat with a mouse. About the fact that what attacked me was no ordinary animal, but something that defied explanation. But as I looked at Officer Johnson's expectant face, I knew. He wouldn't believe me. No one would. I'd be labeled as crazy, traumatized, or attention-seeking. The truth of what happened in those woods would die with me. I'm sure. I said quietly, turning away to hide the tears that threatened to fall. It was a bear. As Officer Johnson left, promising to follow up if they found any leads, I was left alone with the weight of my secret. The creature, Bigfoot, was still out there, hidden in the vast wilderness, and I was its only witness, burdened with a truth that no one would believe. I stared out the window at the distant forest, barely visible in the fading light. Somewhere out there a monster roamed free, and though I had escaped with my life, I knew that the memory of our encounter would haunt me forever. My ordeal in the woods might be over, but a new challenge was just beginning, living with the knowledge of what I had seen and the certainty that no one would ever believe my story. The morning sun filtered through the hospital room window, casting a deceptively cheerful glow on the sterile surroundings. I had barely slept, my dreams plagued by visions of massive, fur-covered forms and glowing, intelligent eyes. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that forest, running for my life from a creature that shouldn't exist. A gentle knock on the door pulled me from my dark thoughts. Dr. Ramirez entered, followed by a woman I didn't recognize. "Good morning, Ms. Smith." Dr. Ramirez greeted me with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "How are you feeling today?" "Like I've been hit by a truck," I replied honestly, wincing as I tried to sit up straighter. "But I guess that's better than feeling like I've been mauled by a bear." I stumbled over the last word, the lie still sitting uncomfortably in my throat. Dr. Ramirez nodded sympathetically, then gestured to the woman beside him. "This is Dr. Chen, our hospital psychologist. I thought it might be helpful for you to talk to her about your experience." I felt a surge of panic. A psychologist? Did they think I was crazy? Then again, if I told them the truth, they certainly would. "Doctor," Chen stepped forward, her kind face set in a reassuring smile. "Hello, Laura. I understand you've been through a traumatic experience. I'm here to help you process that if you're willing." I nodded hesitantly, and Dr. Ramirez excused himself, leaving me alone with Dr. Chen. She pulled up a chair beside my bed and settled in, her notepad balanced on her knee. "Why don't you tell me about what happened in the forest?" she prompted gently. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "I was hiking," I began, the words coming out slowly. "I got lost, and then I was attacked by a bear." Dr. Chen nodded encouragingly. "That must have been terrifying. Can you describe the bear to me?" I hesitated, the memory of the creature flashing through my mind. Its massive humanoid form, the intelligence in its eyes, the way it had toyed with me, hunting me through the forest. "It was big," I said finally, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. "Brown fur, sharp claws. It happened so fast I didn't get a good look." Dr. Chen made a note on her pad. "That's understandable. Trauma can affect our memories, make details fuzzy. How do you feel when you think about the attack?" "Scared," I whispered, and this, at least, was the truth. "Helpless. Like I'm still there, still running." "That's a normal response to a traumatic event," Dr. Chen assured me. "Have you been having nightmares? Flashbacks?" I nodded, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. "Every time I close my eyes, I see it. I hear it, I can smell it." Dr. Chen leaned forward, her voice soft. "Laura, what you're describing sounds like symptoms of PTSD. It's common in survivors of animal attacks. But with therapy and time, these symptoms can improve." I wanted to laugh. PTSD from a bear attack? If only she knew the truth. But how could I tell her? How could I explain that what haunted me wasn't a bear, but a creature out of legend? As Dr. Chen continued to talk about coping strategies and therapy options, my mind wandered. I thought about the creature out there in the forest, hidden from the world. I thought about the truth, burning inside me, begging to be told. "Dr. Chen," I interrupted suddenly, my heart pounding. What if it wasn't a bear?" She paused, her pen hovering over her notepad. "What do you mean, Laura?" I took a deep breath. This was it. The moment of truth. What if I told you it was something else? Something impossible? Dr. Chen's expression remained neutral, but I saw a flicker of concern in her eyes. What do you think it was, Laura? The words were on the tip of my tongue. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, a creature that shouldn't exist. But as I opened my mouth to speak, I saw the look in Dr. Chen's eyes. It was the same look I'd seen in the park ranger's eyes, in Officer Johnson's eyes. Doubt, disbelief. My courage faltered. I don't know, I said finally, deflating. It was probably a bear. I'm just confused, I guess. Dr. Chen nodded, making another note. That's understandable, Laura. Trauma can make our memories unreliable. It's normal to question what happened. As Dr. Chen wrapped up our session, promising to check in on me again tomorrow, I was left alone with my thoughts. The weight of my secret pressed down on me, threatening to suffocate me. Throughout the day, a parade of visitors came and went. Friends from San Francisco, having heard about my bear attack on the news, arrived with flowers and concerned faces. "Oh my God, Laura," my friend Sarah exclaimed, her eyes wide as she took in my battered state. When I heard what happened, I couldn't believe it. A bear attack? That's insane. I forced a weak smile. Yeah, it's pretty crazy. You have to tell us everything, my other friend Mike insisted. What was it like? Were you scared? As I recounted my fabricated story of a bear attack, I could see the mixture of horror and fascination in their eyes. They listened with rapt attention, gasping at all the right moments, offering sympathetic touches and exclamations of, "You're so brave." But with each retelling, the lie grew heavier. I found myself stumbling over details, second-guessing my own words. What color had I said the bear was? How big had I claimed it was? The truth and the lie began to blur together in my mind, leaving me feeling disoriented and lost. As evening fell and my friends finally left, promising to visit again soon, I was left alone with my thoughts. I stared out the window at the distant forest, barely visible in the fading light. Somewhere out there, the creature roamed free, and I was its only witness, burdened with a truth that no one would believe. The local sheriff listened to my tale with a patronizing smile, clearly not believing a word. "Now, Ms. Smith," he said, his tone condescending, "I know you've been through a traumatic experience, but are you sure it was a bear? We haven't had any reports of aggressive bear activity in that area." I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was my chance to tell the truth. "Actually, Sheriff," I began hesitantly, "I'm not sure it was a bear. It was different, bigger, more human-like." The sheriff's eyebrows shot up, and I saw a look pass between him and the nurse standing nearby. It was a look I was becoming all too familiar with, a mixture of pity and disbelief. "Human-like?" the sheriff repeated slowly. "Ms. Smith, are you saying you think you saw... what? Bigfoot?" The word hung in the air between us, and I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment. Put like that, it sounded ridiculous. Crazy. "No, I don't know what I saw." I backtracked quickly. "You're right, it was probably just a bear." I was scared and confused. It happened so fast. The sheriff nodded, patting my hand in a patronizing manner. "That's understandable. Trauma can play tricks on the mind. You just rest and focus on getting better, all right?" As he left, I overheard him muttering to the nurse about shock and possible head trauma. The truth of what happened in those woods would die with me, I realized, because the alternative, admitting what I really saw, was unthinkable. I turned my face to the window, tears streaming silently down my cheeks. The creature was still out there, hidden in the vast wilderness, and I was its only witness, trapped in a prison of disbelief, with a truth too incredible to be spoken aloud. The hospital room felt suffocating as I lay there, surrounded by the constant beeping of machines and the sterile smell of disinfectant. It had been less than 2 days since my rescue from the forest, but it felt like a lifetime. The weight of what I had experienced, and the knowledge that no one would believe me, pressed down on me like a physical force. I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to do something to find some proof of what I had seen. But how? I was confined to this hospital bed, my body battered and broken from my encounter with the creature. The creature that everyone insisted was just a bear. A knock on the door interrupted my thoughts. Dr. Ramirez entered, followed by a man I didn't recognize. "Good morning, Mrs. Smith," Dr. Ramirez greeted me. "How are you feeling today?" "Like I've been hit by a truck," I replied, the same answer I'd given every time he'd asked. "Who's this?" The stranger stepped forward, extending his hand. "I'm Jack Thompson from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. I was hoping I could ask you a few questions about your encounter." I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was my chance to tell someone who would believe me, someone who might have encountered something similar before. "Of course," I said, trying to sit up straighter despite the pain. "What do you want to know?" Jack pulled up a chair beside my bed, notepad in hand. "Can you describe the bear that attacked you? Any distinguishing features?" I hesitated, the truth on the tip of my tongue. But as I opened my mouth to speak, I caught Dr. Ramirez's eye. The warning look he gave me was clear. "Don't say anything crazy." "It was big," I said finally, the lie tasting bitter. "Brown fur, sharp claws. It happened so fast I didn't get a good look." Jack nodded, jotting down notes. "And you're sure it was a bear? Not a mountain lion or a wolf?" I swallowed hard. This was my chance. "Actually," I began, my heart pounding, "I'm not sure it was a bear. It was different." Jack leaned forward, interest piqued. "Different how?" "It was huge," I said, the words tumbling out. "Bigger than any bear I've ever seen or heard of, and it walked on two legs. Its face, it was almost human-like." As soon as the words left my mouth, I saw the change in Jack's expression. The interest faded, replaced by skepticism and barely concealed amusement. "Ms. Smith," he said gently, "what you're describing sounds an awful lot like Bigfoot. You understand that's not, well, it's not a real creature." I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment. "I know how it sounds," I said desperately. "But I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear, it was something else." Jack exchanged a look with Dr. Ramirez, who stepped forward. "Laura," he said softly, "you've been through a traumatic experience. It's not uncommon for the mind to embellish memories in times of extreme stress." I wanted to scream in frustration. Why wouldn't they believe me? But I knew the answer. Because what I was saying was impossible. Because Bigfoot didn't exist. "You're right," I said finally, defeated. "I must be confused. It was probably just a bear." Jack nodded, seemingly relieved. "Well, thank you for your time, Ms. Smith. We'll continue to investigate the incident, but it sounds like a typical case of a black bear encounter." As they left, I felt a wave of despair wash over me. I was alone with my truth, with no way to prove it. Later that day, against Dr. Ramirez's advice, I convinced a nurse to bring me my laptop. I needed to do something, to find some shred of evidence that what I had experienced was real. I spent hours scouring online forums and Bigfoot communities, searching for any reports similar to mine. But all I found was ridicule and far-fetched theories, blurry photos that could be anything, stories that sounded more like campfire tales than actual encounters. "This is useless," I muttered, closing yet another tab filled with unconvincing evidence. Just as I was about to give up, a news article caught my eye. "Mysterious footprints found in Redwood National Park," the headline read. My heart raced as I clicked on the link. The article described a set of large humanoid footprints found in a remote area of the park, not far from where I had been hiking. The prints were dismissed by experts as a hoax, but the photos accompanying the article made my blood run cold. They looked exactly like the prints I had seen in the forest. Excitement and vindication surged through me. This was it. Proof that I wasn't crazy, that what I had seen was real. I quickly copied the link, ready to show it to Dr. Ramirez, to Jack, to anyone who would listen. But as my finger hovered over the send button, doubt crept in. Would this really convince anyone? Or would it just make me look more unhinged, desperately clinging to anything that might validate my delusion? With a heavy heart, I closed the laptop. The truth was, no matter what evidence I found, no one would believe me. The few plaster casts I could potentially make of footprints would be dismissed as hoaxes by local authorities. Any photos or videos would be scrutinized and debunked as fakes. I was trapped in a prison of disbelief with no way out. As night fell, I found myself staring out the window at the distant forest, barely visible in the fading light. Somewhere out there, the creature roamed free, and I was its only witness, burdened with a truth that no one would ever accept. The weight of this knowledge pressed down on me, threatening to crush my spirit. How could I go on, knowing what I knew, experiencing what I had experienced, while the rest of the world remained blissfully ignorant? I closed my eyes, trying to find some peace, but all I could see was the forest. The shadows between the trees seemed to move, taking on monstrous shapes. I could hear the snap of twigs, the rustle of leaves, the heavy breathing of something large and inhuman. My eyes snapped open, my heart pounding. The hospital room came back into focus, but the fear lingered. I knew then that escaping the forest hadn't been the end of my ordeal. The real struggle was just beginning. As I lay there in the dark, listening to the quiet beeping of machines, I made a decision. I couldn't keep this to myself. I couldn't let the truth die with me. Somehow, some way, I had to make people believe. I had to find a way to prove that what I had seen was real. But how? How could I prove the existence of a creature that left no trace, that vanished into the wilderness without a sound? How could I convince a world that was determined to dismiss my experience as trauma-induced delusion? As sleep finally began to claim me, one thought echoed in my mind. The search for truth had only just begun, and no matter what it took, I would find a way to make the world believe. The soft glow of the hospital room's nightlight did little to comfort me as I lay awake, my mind racing with the events of the past 2 days. Sleep eluded me, chased away by the vivid memories of my encounter in the forest. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those intelligent, inhuman eyes staring back at me, heard the creature's bone-chilling roar echoing through the trees. As dawn broke, casting long shadows across the room, a nurse entered to check my vitals. She frowned as she noted my readings. "Did you get any sleep at all, Mrs. Smith?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. I shook my head, not trusting myself to speak. How could I explain that every time I drifted off, I was back in that forest, running for my life from a monster that shouldn't exist? The nurse sighed. "I'll speak to Dr. Ramirez about prescribing something to help you sleep. You need rest to heal." As she left, I reached for my phone, wincing at the pain that shot through my battered body. I had dozens of missed calls and messages from friends and family, all expressing concern and asking for details about the bear attack. The lie I had been forced to tell weighed heavily on me. I opened a message from my best friend Sarah. "Hey, just checking in. How are you feeling? Everyone's talking about your bear encounter. You're like a local celebrity. Call me when you're up to it, okay?" Local celebrity. The words made me feel sick. If only they knew the truth. Throughout the morning, a steady stream of visitors came and went. Friends, colleagues, even a local news reporter hoping for an exclusive interview about my heroic survival. Each time I recounted the false story of the bear attack, the lie becoming more elaborate with each telling. "It was huge," I heard myself saying to the reporter, my voice sounding hollow and distant to my own ears. "Came out of nowhere. I thought I was done for." "Incredible," the reporter breathed, scribbling notes furiously. "You're lucky to be alive. How does it feel to have survived such an ordeal?" "Lucky." The word echoed in my head, mocking me. I didn't feel lucky. I felt trapped, suffocated by a truth I couldn't share. As the day wore on, I found myself growing increasingly irritable. Every well-meaning question, every sympathetic look, grated on my nerves. I just wanted to be left alone with my thoughts, to try and make sense of what had happened to me. Dr. Chen, the hospital psychologist, stopped by in the afternoon for another session. She settled into the chair beside my bed, her kind face set in a concerned expression. "How are you feeling today, Laura?" she asked gently. I shrugged, wincing at the pain the movement caused. "Fine, I guess, just tired." Dr. Chen nodded. "That's understandable. You've been through a traumatic experience. It's normal to have trouble sleeping, to feel on edge." I nodded absently, my gaze drawn to the window. In the distance, I could see the edge of the forest where my nightmare had begun. "Laura," Dr. Chen's voice pulled me back to the present. "I noticed you've been talking a lot about the attack, reliving it with each visitor. How does that make you feel?" I turned to look at her, feeling a sudden surge of frustration. "How does it make me feel? It makes me feel like I'm going crazy, like I'm living a lie. Because I am living a lie." Dr. Chen leaned forward, her brow furrowed. "What do you mean, Laura?" For a moment, I considered telling her everything. About the creature's massive humanoid form, about its intelligent eyes and the way it had hunted me through the forest, about the fact that what attacked me was no ordinary animal, but something that defied explanation. But as I opened my mouth to speak, I saw the look in her eyes, that same mixture of concern and skepticism I'd seen in everyone else. She wouldn't believe me. No one would. "Nothing," I said finally, deflating. "I'm just tired of talking about it. Can we be done for today?" Dr. Chen nodded, making a note in her pad. "Of course. But Laura, remember, it's important to process what happened. Bottling it up won't help you heal." As she left, I felt a wave of isolation wash over me. I was alone with my truth, trapped in a prison of disbelief. That evening, as I picked at my hospital dinner, a breaking news alert on the TV caught my attention. The anchor's voice filled the room. "In local news, rangers at Redwood National Park have reported an increase in animal activity following the recent bear attack on hiker Laura Smith. Visitors are advised to exercise caution and report any unusual sightings." I froze, the fork halfway to my mouth. Unusual sightings. Could it be? Had someone else seen the creature? With shaking hands, I reached for my laptop, ignoring the pain that shot through my arms. I spent the next several hours scouring news sites, social media, and cryptozoology forums for any hint of Bigfoot activity in the area. As the night wore on, my room became a chaotic mess of open tabs and scribbled notes. Maps of the park covered my bed, marked with possible sighting locations. Blurry photos of supposed Bigfoot encounters were taped to my walls. I was so engrossed in my research that I barely noticed the nurse who came to check on me, her eyes widening at the state of my room. "Mrs. Smith?" she said hesitantly. "Is everything all right?" I looked up, suddenly aware of how I must appear, wild-eyed, surrounded by Bigfoot evidence. "I'm fine," I said quickly, closing my laptop. "Just doing some research." The nurse nodded slowly, clearly unconvinced. "All right, try to get some rest, okay?" As she left, I caught sight of my reflection in the darkened window. I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. My eyes were sunken, ringed with dark circles. My hair was a tangled mess. I looked obsessed, and maybe I was. But how could I not be? I had seen something impossible, something that challenged everything I thought I knew about the world, and no one believed me. I turned back to my laptop, determined to find some shred of evidence to support my experience. But as the hours ticked by, and the first light of dawn began to creep through the window, I was no closer to proving the truth of what I had seen. The creature, Bigfoot, was still out there, hidden in the vast wilderness. And I was its only witness, trapped in a hospital room, slowly losing myself to an obsession that threatened to consume me. As I finally drifted off to sleep, exhausted and frustrated, one thought echoed in my mind. I had to find a way to make people believe, because if I couldn't, I feared I might truly lose my mind. The morning sun filtered through the hospital room window, casting long shadows across the cluttered space. I blinked awake, momentarily disoriented by the chaos surrounding me. Maps, printouts, and scribbled notes covering every surface. The events of the past 48 hours came rushing back, and with them, the weight of my impossible truth. A gentle knock on the door pulled me from my thoughts. Dr. Ramirez entered, his eyebrows raising slightly at the state of my room. "Good morning, Ms. Smith," he said, his tone cautious. "How are you feeling today?" I sat up slowly, wincing at the pain that still radiated through my body. I'm not sure," I answered honestly. Dr. Ramirez nodded, pulling up a chair beside my bed. "Laura, I've been speaking with Dr. Chen and the nursing staff. We're concerned about you." I felt a flicker of panic. "Concerned? Why?" He gestured to the cluttered room. "This obsessive behavior, the sleepless nights, the constant talk about your attack, it's not healthy. We think it might be best if you speak with a trauma specialist." I shook my head vehemently. "No, you don't understand. I'm not obsessed, I'm trying to find the truth. What happened to me out there? It wasn't a bear, Dr. Ramirez. It was something else." Dr. Ramirez sighed, his expression a mixture of concern and pity. "Laura, we've been over this. There's no evidence of any creature other than a bear in that forest. What you experienced was traumatic, and it's natural for the mind to—" "To what?" I interrupted, anger flaring. "To make things up? To imagine monsters?" "I know what I saw." The doctor held up his hands in a placating gesture. "I'm not saying you're making things up. I'm saying that trauma can affect our perceptions, our memories. It's important that you work through this with a professional." I turned away, staring out the window at the distant forest. The creature was out there. I knew it. But how could I prove it? "When can I leave?" I asked abruptly. Dr. Ramirez seemed taken aback by the sudden change of subject. "Well, physically you're healing well. We could potentially discharge you tomorrow, but I'd strongly recommend you stay for a few more days for psychological observation." I shook my head. "No, I want to leave tomorrow. I need to go home." The doctor looked like he wanted to argue, but instead, he nodded reluctantly. "All right. But I want you to promise me you'll follow up with a therapist. And please try to rest. Don't do anything rash." As he left, I felt a mix of relief and apprehension. I was finally getting out of this sterile prison, but what awaited me in the outside world? How could I go back to my normal life knowing what I knew? The rest of the day passed in a blur of final checkups and discharge paperwork. Friends called, offering to pick me up, to stay with me. But I declined. I needed to be alone, to think, to plan. As evening fell, I stood at the window, staring out at the darkening sky. In the distance, I could see the edge of the forest where my nightmare had begun. A year after the attack, I stood at the edge of the forest, the scars on my body a constant reminder of what I had endured. I knew the creature was out there, watching and waiting, but I was powerless to prove it. The weight of the truth pressed down on me, a burden I would carry for the rest of my life. A nurse entered, startling me from my reverie. "Ms. Smith, your discharge papers are ready. Is someone coming to pick you up in the morning?" I nodded absently, not taking my eyes off the forest. "Yes, I've arranged a ride." As night fell, I thought I saw a pair of eyes gleaming in the darkness, but they vanished in an instant. A chill ran down my spine. Was it out there, watching me even now? Sleep eluded me that night, my mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. How could I go back to my normal life? How could I face my friends, my family, knowing what I knew? As dawn broke, I gathered my belongings, my hands shaking slightly as I packed away the maps and notes I'd accumulated. Part of me wanted to leave them behind, to try and forget everything. But I couldn't. The truth was a part of me now, for better or worse. A nurse arrived with a wheelchair. Hospital policy for discharges. As she helped me into it, she chatted cheerfully about the beautiful day ahead. I barely heard her. my eyes fixed on the forest visible through the window. "Are you excited to go home?" she asked as she wheeled me towards the elevator. I forced a smile. Yes, of course. But the truth was, I didn't know how I felt. Excited? Terrified? Lost? All of the above? As we reached the hospital entrance, I saw my friend Sarah waiting by her car, a bright smile on her face. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what lay ahead. "Laura!" Sarah exclaimed, rushing forward to hug me gently. "Oh my God, it's so good to see you up and about. How are you feeling?" I returned her hug, fighting back the urge to tell her everything. I'm okay. Just glad to be out of there." As Sarah helped me into the car, chattering about how everyone was looking forward to seeing me, I cast one last glance at the distant forest. For a moment, I thought I saw something move among the trees, something large and dark. But when I blinked, it was gone. "Laura?" Sarah's voice pulled me back to the present. "Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." I turned away from the window, forcing a smile. "I'm fine. Just tired. Let's go home." As we drove away from the hospital, leaving behind the scene of my terrifying encounter, I knew that while I was leaving the woods, and the secrets they held, would never truly leave me. The creature was still out there, hidden in the vast wilderness, and I was its only witness, trapped between two worlds, the normal, everyday world where Bigfoot was just a myth, and the terrifying reality I had experienced. I turned away from the forest, knowing that my encounter with Bigfoot would forever remain a mystery to the world, but a vivid reality in my haunted memories. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with doubts and unanswered questions. But one thing was clear: my life would never be the same again. As we drove into an uncertain future, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't truly the end. Somewhere out there, in the depths of the forest, a creature that defied explanation roamed free. And though I might never see it again, the memory of our encounter would haunt me for the rest of my days. The truth was out there, hidden in the shadows of the forest. And though the world might never believe me, I knew what I had seen. The question that remained was, what would I do with this knowledge? Only time would tell. I never should have gone camping alone. That's what everyone tells you, right? But I've always been the adventurous type, and after a grueling month at work, I desperately needed to disconnect. The Appalachian Mountains seemed like the perfect escape, vast, beautiful, and far from the chaos of city life. If only I had known what was waiting for me in those woods. The drive from Pittsburgh was long but peaceful. As I wound my way through the increasingly remote roads, the lush green canopy of the Appalachian forest engulfed me. My cell phone signal faded in and out, and eventually disappeared altogether. It was just me, my old Subaru, and the open road. I arrived at the ranger station in the late afternoon. The sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows across the parking lot. As I stepped out of my car, stretching my cramped muscles, I noticed an older man in a park ranger uniform approaching. "You must be Nick Foster," he said, extending a weathered hand. "I'm Ranger Thompson, got your camping permit right here." I shook his hand, grateful for the warm welcome. "Thanks, Ranger. Any tips for a solo camper?" Thompson's expression darkened slightly. "Actually, I'm glad you asked. We've had some unusual activity in the area lately. Probably just some aggressive black bears, but I'd advise extra caution." A chill ran down my spine despite the warm summer air. "Unusual how?" The ranger hesitated, then said, "Some hikers reported strange noises at night, and we found some disturbed campsites, torn tents, scattered gear. Nothing conclusive, mind you, but enough to make us concerned." I swallowed hard, suddenly questioning my decision to come alone. "Should I maybe not camp here?" Thompson waved his hand dismissively. "Nah, you'll be fine. Just keep your food sealed up tight and make plenty of noise if you're hiking. And if you hear anything strange at night, don't investigate. Stay in your tent and wait for daylight." I nodded, trying to shake off the unease. Got it. Thanks for the heads up. As I drove deeper into the park, following the ranger's directions to my designated campsite, an eerie silence settled over the forest. The usual chirping of birds and rustling of small animals seemed muted, as if the entire woods were holding its breath. I cranked up the radio, desperate for some human sound, but only static came through the speakers. Finally, I reached the small clearing that would be my home for the next 2 nights. It was beautiful, a flat area surrounded by towering pines, with a small stream bubbling nearby. But as I stepped out of the car, that unsettling silence hit me again. The ranger's warning about recent animal attacks echoed in my mind as I began to set up my tent. My hands shook slightly as I hammered in the tent stakes. Every snapping twig or distant rustle made me jump. Get it together, Nick, I muttered to myself. It's just the woods. You've done this 100 times. As the sun began to set, I focused on building a campfire. The familiar routine helped calm my nerves, and soon I had a cheerful blaze going. I sat back in my camp chair, cracking open a beer and trying to relax. The fire's warmth and the gentle sound of the stream started to work their magic, and I felt my muscles begin to unclench. That's when I heard it, a twig snapping in the distance, much louder than any squirrel or raccoon could make. I sat bolt upright, my eyes straining to pierce the gathering darkness beyond the fire's light. For a moment I could have sworn I saw movement, a massive, hunched figure slipping between the trees. But when I blinked, it was gone. Hello? I called out, my voice embarrassingly shaky. Is someone there? Only silence answered me. I stood up, grabbing my flashlight and sweeping its beam across the tree line. Nothing but shadows and swaying branches. I laughed nervously, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination running wild after the ranger's warning. As the night deepened, I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. The campfire's flames cast dancing shadows on the trees, playing tricks on my eyes. More than once I thought I saw that massive figure again, always just at the edge of my vision. This is ridiculous, I said aloud, hoping the sound of my own voice would chase away the fear. There's nothing out there. You're letting that ranger's story get to you. But even as I said it, I couldn't quite believe it. There was something off about these woods. The air felt heavy, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. And that silence, it was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I decided to turn in early, hoping that sleep would reset my frayed nerves. As I zipped up my sleeping bag, a low, guttural growl pierced the night. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not quite bear, not quite wolf, but something other. Something that sent primal fear coursing through my veins. I lay there in the darkness, every muscle tense, straining my ears for any further sound. But the forest had fallen silent again, as if that growl had never happened. Had I imagined it? Was my mind playing tricks on me? Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and filled with unsettling dreams. I tossed and turned, plagued by visions of massive, shadowy creatures lurking just beyond the firelight. In my dreams, I ran through endless dark forests, always pursued by something I couldn't quite see, but knew was there. I don't know how long I slept, but I jolted awake sometime in the dead of night. The fire had burned down to embers, leaving the campsite in near total darkness. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was or what had woken me. Then I heard it. Heavy footsteps circling my tent. My heart began to pound so loudly I was sure whatever was out there must be able to hear it. I lay perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe, as the footsteps drew closer. They were slow, deliberate, like nothing I'd ever heard before. Too heavy for a person, too rhythmic for a bear. The footsteps paused right outside my tent. I could hear deep, ragged breathing and caught a whiff of a foul, musky odor seeping through the tent fabric. It made me gag, and I had to struggle not to cough or make any noise. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as I lay there, paralyzed with fear. I wanted to scream, to run, to do something, but my body refused to obey. All I could do was wait, praying that whatever was out there would lose interest and move on. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the footsteps began to move away. I let out a shaky breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. But my relief was short-lived. Just as I thought it was over, a massive shadow loomed over my tent, blocking out what little moonlight filtered through the trees. The outline was unmistakably that of some enormous ape-like creature, far larger than any bear or man. I squeezed my eyes shut, my entire body trembling. This couldn't be real. It had to be a nightmare. Any second now, I'd wake up in my own bed, laughing at how ridiculous this all was. But I didn't wake up. And as the shadow lingered, I realized with growing horror that this was no dream. Whatever was out there, it was real, and it was watching me. As quickly as it had appeared, the shadow vanished. The heavy footsteps retreated into the forest, leaving me alone in the oppressive darkness. I lay there, shaking and sweating, unable to process what had just happened. One thing was certain: I wouldn't be getting any more sleep tonight. As I waited for dawn, my mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. What had I just encountered? And more importantly, would it be back? Little did I know. This was only the beginning of a nightmare that would change my life forever. I lay in my tent, every muscle tense, my ears straining for any sound in the oppressive silence that had fallen over the forest. The events from earlier, the massive shadow, the heavy footsteps, that awful stench, kept replaying in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I had encountered was still out there, watching, waiting. "Get a grip, Nick," I whispered to myself, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet night. It was probably just a bear. A really big, weird-smelling bear. But even as I said it, I knew I was lying to myself. What I had seen was no bear. It was something else. Something that shouldn't exist. I don't know how long I lay there, my heart pounding so loudly, I was sure it would give away my location to whatever was out there. Minutes stretched into hours, each second an eternity of fear and anticipation. I tried to convince myself to unzip the tent to look outside, but my body refused to move. Just as exhaustion began to overtake my fear, I heard it again. Heavy footsteps circling my tent. My breath caught in my throat, and I squeezed my eyes shut, as if not seeing would somehow make it not real. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. Whatever it was in no hurry. It was toying with me, I realized with growing horror. Like a cat playing with a mouse before the kill. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. "Is someone there?" Silence. The footsteps had stopped. For a moment, I dared to hope that it had all been in my imagination. Then, a low, rumbling growl answered me, so close it seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath me. I clapped a hand over my mouth to stifle a scream. This was no human sound, nor any animal I'd ever encountered. It was primal, ancient, filled with a hunger that sent ice through my veins. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise. I strained my ears for any sign of the creature's presence, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The suspense was unbearable. Was it still out there? Had it left? Or was it preparing to attack? Suddenly, a new smell hit me, a foul, musky odor that seeped through the tent fabric. It was so strong, so alien, that I gagged, struggling to breathe quietly. My eyes watered, and I fought the urge to cough, terrified of making any noise that might provoke the creature. "Please," I whispered, though to whom or what I wasn't sure. "Please just go away." As if in answer to my plea, a shadow fell over my tent. I watched in horror as an enormous silhouette loomed above me, blocking out the moonlight and revealing the outline of a monstrous ape-like creature. It was massive, far larger than any man or known animal. I could make out broad shoulders, long arms that nearly touched the ground, and a head that seemed to sit directly on those shoulders with no discernible neck. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, as the creature slowly raised one enormous hand. For a terrible moment, I was certain it was about to rip through the tent and drag me out. I could almost feel those powerful fingers closing around me, crushing the life from my body. But the attack never came. Instead, the creature simply stood there, its shadow engulfing my small tent. I don't know how long we remained like that, me, frozen in terror, and the monster, silent and still as a statue. Time seemed to lose all meaning. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow vanished. I heard heavy footsteps retreating into the forest, branches snapping under its weight. The oppressive presence that had hung over my campsite began to lift, like a storm cloud passing. I lay there, trembling and drenched in cold sweat, unable to believe what had just happened. Part of me wanted to leap up, to run to my car and drive as far and as fast as I could. But fear kept me rooted in place. What if it was still out there waiting for me to emerge? This can't be real, I muttered, running a shaking hand through my sweat-soaked hair. Bigfoot isn't real. It's just a myth, a legend. This has to be some kind of hallucination. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. The terror I had felt, the awful smell that still lingered in the air, it was all too vivid, too visceral to be a hallucination. As the adrenaline began to wear off, exhaustion hit me like a truck. My eyelids grew heavy despite my determination to stay awake and alert. The fear of falling asleep, of being vulnerable, warred with my body's desperate need for rest. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I knew, pale morning light was filtering through the tent fabric. I sat up with a start, my heart racing as the memories of the night came flooding back. For a moment, I just sat there, listening. The forest had come alive with the sounds of birds and small animals. It was as if the oppressive silence of the night had never happened. Had it all been a nightmare? With trembling hands, I unzipped the tent and poked my head out. The campsite looked exactly as I had left it the night before. There were no massive footprints, no signs of disturbance. The only evidence of anything unusual was the lingering trace of that musky odor, now almost masked by the scent of pine and morning dew. I stumbled out of the tent, my legs weak and shaky. The bright morning sunlight felt surreal after the terrors of the night. I half expected to see the creature standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me with those inhuman eyes I had imagined. But there was nothing, just trees, rocks, and the gentle sound of the nearby stream. "I'm losing my mind," I said aloud, running my hands over my face. "That's the only explanation. I'm having some kind of mental breakdown." But even as I tried to rationalize what had happened, I knew deep down that it had been real. The primal fear I had felt, the certainty that I was about to die, those weren't things you could imagine, no matter how vivid your imagination. I paced around the campsite, torn between the urge to flee and the need to find some evidence, something to prove to myself that I wasn't crazy. My eyes scanned the ground, the trees, looking for any sign of the creature's presence. That's when I saw it. A tuft of coarse dark hair caught on a low-hanging branch. My heart began to race as I approached it. With shaking hands, I plucked it from the branch and held it up to the light. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. Too coarse for human hair, too long for any local animal. "Oh God," I whispered, the reality of the situation crashing down on me. "It's real. It's all real." As I stood there, clutching the hair like a lifeline to sanity, a distant roar echoed through the mountains. Birds scattered from the treetops, their panicked cries filling the air. The sound was unmistakable, the same guttural, inhuman roar I had heard in the night. Ice flooded my veins as I realized the truth. The creature was still out there. And somehow, I knew with chilling certainty that it wasn't done with me yet. The night had only been the beginning. Whatever this thing was, this Bigfoot, this monster, it had marked me. And I had a sickening feeling that it would not rest until it had finished what it had started. With trembling hands, I began to pack up my gear. I had to get out of these woods, to get back to civilization where I could convince myself that this had all been some vivid nightmare. But even as I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that those inhuman eyes were following my every move from the shadows of the forest. The real terror, I realized, was just beginning. The morning sun had barely risen when I stumbled out of my tent, my body aching from the tension of the night before. I blinked in the harsh light, half expecting to see the monstrous creature standing at the edge of my campsite. But the clearing was empty, peaceful even, as if the terrors of the night had never happened. It was just a dream, I muttered, trying to convince myself. Just a really vivid, terrifying dream. But as I took a few shaky steps away from my tent, my foot sank into something soft and yielding. I looked down, and my heart nearly stopped. There, in the damp earth, was a footprint. But not just any footprint. This was massive, easily twice the size of my own boot, with 5 distinct toe impressions. "No," I whispered, stumbling backward. "No, no, no." I spun around, suddenly hyper-aware of my surroundings. And that's when I saw them. A trail of these enormous, human-like footprints surrounding my campsite. They circled my tent just as I had heard the creature do in the night. The reality of what had happened hit me like a physical blow. With trembling hands, I pulled out my phone to take pictures, but in my panic, I dropped it. The screen cracked as it hit a rock, and when I picked it up, it wouldn't turn on. I cursed, realizing I had no way to document what I was seeing. "Okay, Nick," I said aloud, trying to calm myself. "Think. What would a park ranger do?" I decided to examine the area more closely. As I followed the trail of footprints, I noticed other disturbing signs. Broken branches littered the ground, some as thick as my arm, snapped like twigs, and caught on some of these branches were tufts of coarse, dark hair. I plucked one of these hairs, holding it up to the light. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen, too thick for human hair, too long for any local animal. The sight of it made my skin crawl, but I carefully tucked it into my pocket. At least this was some tangible evidence of whatever had visited in the night. As I continued my investigation, I came across a nearby tree that bore deep claw marks. My breath caught in my throat as I realized how high up the trunk these marks were, far higher than any known animal could reach. I stretched my arm up, standing on my toes, and my fingertips barely grazed the bottom of the lowest mark. "This is impossible," I muttered, my mind reeling. "Nothing this big exists. It can't." But the evidence was right in front of me, undeniable and terrifying. Whatever had stalked my campsite last night was real, and it was enormous. I was so engrossed in examining the claw marks that I almost missed the sound at first. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, a roar shattered the morning calm. It was the same bone-chilling sound I'd heard the night before, but louder now, closer. Birds exploded from the treetops in a panic, their frightened calls adding to the cacophony. I didn't think, I just ran. I sprinted back to my campsite, my survival instinct kicking into overdrive. I had to get out of here now. My hands shook as I tried to pack up my gear, fumbling with zippers and straps. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept expecting to feel massive hands grabbing me, to smell that awful musky odor. Come on," I muttered, shoving my sleeping bag into its stuff sack without bothering to roll it properly. Just as I was about to start taking down my tent, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the underbrush. It was coming from the direction I'd have to take to get back to my car. I froze, indecision paralyzing me. Should I run and hope I could make it to my vehicle before the creature caught me? Or should I stay put and hope it would pass by? The decision was made for me when I caught a glimpse of movement through the trees. For just a second, I saw a massive, fur-covered form moving with surprising grace for its size. Then it was gone. But the image was seared into my brain. I ducked into my tent, zipping it closed as if the thin fabric could offer any protection. I huddled there, barely daring to breathe as I heard the creature moving around my campsite. The footsteps paused right outside my tent. I could hear deep, ragged breathing, and that awful smell seeped through the fabric again. I pressed a hand to my mouth, fighting the urge to gag or scream. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. I don't know how long I sat there, every muscle tense, waiting for the creature to either leave or attack. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I heard the footsteps moving away. I waited until I could no longer hear any sound before I dared to unzip the tent. Peering out, I saw that my campsite was a mess. My backpack had been tossed aside, its contents strewn about. The remnants of last night's fire were scattered, still warm embers smoking in the grass. But the creature was gone. I emerged from the tent on shaky legs, my eyes darting around, searching for any sign of the beast. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. My car keys were missing. "No," I whispered, frantically searching through the scattered contents of my backpack. No. But it was useless. The keys were gone. Whether the creature had intentionally taken them or they'd simply been lost in the chaos, I was now stranded in these woods with that thing. I sank to my knees, overwhelmed by the reality of my situation. I was alone in the wilderness, my only means of escape gone, being hunted by a creature that shouldn't exist. As if to drive this point home, another roar echoed through the mountains, closer this time. Too close. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing my backpack and shoving whatever supplies I could into it. There was no time to break down the tent or worry about the rest of my gear. I had to move now. With one last look at the campsite that had become a scene from a nightmare, I plunged into the forest. I had no plan beyond putting as much distance between myself and that creature as possible. As I ran, branches whipping at my face and roots threatening to trip me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being herded, that each step I took was leading me exactly where the creature wanted me to go. The forest seemed to close in around me, shadows deepening despite the morning sun. And somewhere behind me, I could hear the sound of pursuit. Heavy footsteps and snapping branches, growing ever closer. The chase was on, and I had a sickening feeling that this game of cat and mouse was far from over. Whatever this creature was, this Bigfoot, it wasn't done with me yet. And as I ran deeper into the wilderness, my only hope was that I could somehow survive what was coming next. My lungs burned as I raced through the forest, my backpack bouncing painfully against my spine with each frantic step. The sound of pursuit was unmistakable, heavy footfalls and snapping branches, growing closer with each passing second. Whatever was chasing me was fast, impossibly fast for something so large. This can't be happening, I gasped between ragged breaths. This isn't real. But the burning in my muscles and the terror coursing through my veins were all too real. I dodged around trees, leaped over fallen logs, my feet barely touching the ground. I had no idea where I was going. My only thought was to put as much distance as possible between myself and the creature. The forest floor began to slope upward, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I was running uphill. My already burning legs protested as the incline steepened, but I pushed on. I didn't dare look back, afraid of what I might see. Suddenly, a deafening roar shattered the air behind me, so close it seemed to vibrate through my very bones. The sound was primal, filled with rage and hunger. It spurred me to run faster than I thought possible, adrenaline flooding my system. "Help!" I screamed, though I knew it was futile. There was no one out here to hear me, no one to come to my rescue. "Somebody, please." My foot caught on an exposed root and I stumbled, nearly falling. As I regained my balance, I risked a glance over my shoulder. What I saw made my blood run cold. Through the trees, I caught a glimpse of matted fur and glowing eyes. The creature was massive, its shoulders easily as broad as a car, long arms swinging as it ran. It moved with a fluid grace that belied its size, effortlessly navigating the dense forest. "Oh God," I whimpered, pushing myself to run even faster, but it was no use. The creature was gaining on me, closing the distance with terrifying speed. I could hear its heavy breathing now, smell that awful musky odor that had permeated my campsite. In my panic, I didn't notice the change in terrain until it was too late. The ground suddenly gave way beneath my feet and I found myself tumbling down a steep ravine. My body was battered by rocks and branches as I fell, each impact sending shockwaves of pain through me. I landed hard at the bottom, the wind knocked out of me. For a moment I lay there, dazed and in agony, struggling to breathe. Then slowly I raised my head, and my heart nearly stopped. There at the top of the ravine stood the creature. Bigfoot. It was even more terrifying up close. Easily 8 feet tall, its body covered in thick matted fur. But it was the eyes that held me transfixed. Intelligent, predatory, and filled with an otherworldly hunger. "Please," I whispered, though I knew it was useless. This wasn't a creature that could be reasoned with. This was a force of nature, a predator, and I was its prey. The creature tilted its head, studying me with an unsettling intensity. Then, with deliberate slowness, it began to descend the ravine. Its massive hands easily found purchase on the rocky slope, its movements sure and purposeful. I scrambled backward, ignoring the pain shooting through my battered body. My hand closed around a fallen branch, and I clutched it like a lifeline. It was a pitiful weapon against such a monster, but it was all I had. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. "I'm warning you." The creature paused, as if considering my words. For a brief, hopeful moment, I thought it might retreat. But then its lips pulled back in a snarl, revealing rows of yellowed teeth, and I knew there would be no escape. As Bigfoot reached the bottom of the ravine, I struggled to my feet, holding the branch out in front of me like a sword. My entire body shook with terror and exhaustion, but I was determined to go down fighting. "Come on then," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "Let's finish this." The creature's roar shook the very ground, showering me with debris from the ravine walls. It lunged forward with surprising speed, its massive hand swinging towards me. I swung the branch with all my might, connecting with a sickening thud against the creature's head. For a split second I felt a surge of triumph. I had actually landed a hit. But my victory was short-lived. The blow seemed to only enrage the beast further. With a swipe of its arm, it knocked the branch from my hand, sending it flying into the underbrush. I stumbled backward, my back pressing against the ravine wall. There was nowhere left to run, nowhere to hide. The creature loomed over me, its hot, fetid breath washing over my face. I could see my terrified reflection in its dark, intelligent eyes. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though I wasn't sure who I was apologizing to. Maybe to myself for coming out here alone. Maybe to my family who would never know what happened to me. The creature raised its massive hand, and I braced myself for the killing blow. I squeezed my eyes shut, not wanting my last sight to be those terrible, hungry eyes. But the blow never came. Instead, a sharp crack echoed through the ravine, followed by the unmistakable sound of a gunshot. My eyes flew open just in time to see the creature rear back, roaring in pain or surprise, I couldn't tell which. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The creature's eyes met mine one last time, and I saw something there I hadn't expected. Fear. Then, with a speed that defied its size, it turned and bounded up the ravine, disappearing into the forest above. I slid down the ravine wall, my legs no longer able to support me. My mind struggled to process what had just happened. I had been seconds away from death, saved by... What? Who had fired that shot? "Hello?" I called out, my voice hoarse and shaky. "Is someone there? Please, I need help." But there was no answer. The forest had fallen silent again, as if the entire confrontation had been nothing but a fever dream. I don't know how long I sat there, shaking and struggling to breathe. The adrenaline began to wear off, and pain flooded my body. Every inch of me ached from the fall and the chase. As my racing heart began to slow, the reality of what had just happened crashed over me. I had come face to face with a creature that shouldn't exist, a monster straight out of legend, and I had survived if only by sheer luck. But as I looked around the ravine, I realized with a sinking feeling that there was no evidence of the encounter. No massive footprints in the soft earth, no tufts of fur caught on the branches. Even the branch I had used as a weapon was nowhere to be seen. Who would believe me? Who would take seriously the ramblings of a battered, terrified man claiming to have fought Bigfoot in the Appalachian wilderness? As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ravine, I knew I had to move. I couldn't stay here, exposed and vulnerable. Whatever had saved me, whether a random hunter or something else entirely, might not be around if the creature came back. With agonizing slowness, I pulled myself to my feet. Every movement sent shockwaves of pain through my battered body, but the fear of what lurked in these woods was stronger than any physical discomfort. As I began the difficult climb out of the ravine, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The creature was still out there, somewhere in these vast, dark woods, and something told me that our paths would cross again before this nightmare was truly over. With each painful step, I steeled myself for what was to come. Because one thing was certain, the real confrontation, the true test of survival, was still ahead. And next time I might not be so lucky. The ravine loomed before me, a dark gash in the earth that seemed to stretch endlessly upward. My body screamed in protest as I began the arduous climb, every movement sending jolts of pain through my battered limbs. But the memory of those inhuman eyes, that massive silhouette, drove me onward. I couldn't stay here, exposed and vulnerable. "Come on, Nick," I muttered to myself, my voice hoarse and barely recognizable. "You can do this. You have to do this." As I clawed my way up the steep incline, loose rocks and dirt cascading down around me, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig made me flinch, expecting to see that monstrous form lunging at me again. Halfway up the ravine, I paused to catch my breath, my chest heaving with exertion. That's when I heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the very earth. My blood ran cold as I slowly turned my head, dreading what I might see. There, at the top of the ravine, stood the creature. Bigfoot. It was somehow even more terrifying in the fading light, its massive form silhouetted against the darkening sky. Those eyes, gleaming with an otherworldly intelligence, were fixed on me. "No," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Please, no." The creature's lips pulled back in a snarl, revealing rows of yellowed teeth. Then, with a grace that belied its enormous size, it began to descend the ravine. Its massive hands easily found purchase on the rocky slope, covering in seconds what had taken me minutes of painful climbing. Panic surged through me, overriding the pain and exhaustion. I scrambled upward, my fingers bleeding as they scraped against sharp rocks. But it was useless. The creature was too fast, too powerful. I was trapped in the ravine, with nowhere to run. As Bigfoot reached me, its musky, overpowering scent filled my nostrils, making me gag. I pressed myself against the ravine wall, my hands frantically searching for anything to use as a weapon. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. "I'm warning you." But the creature paid no heed to my words. It reached out with one massive hand, and I felt its fingers, each as thick as my wrist, wrap around my ankle. With terrifying strength, it yanked me off my feet. I screamed as I was dragged across the forest floor, my fingernails breaking and bleeding as I clawed desperately at the ground. Rocks and branches tore at my clothes and skin, but the creature's grip was relentless. "Help!" I cried out, though I knew it was futile. "Somebody, please!" The creature dragged me effortlessly, as if I weighed nothing. Through my panic, I realized we were moving uphill away from the ravine. Where was it taking me? To its lair? To some secluded spot where it could finish me off without interruption? Suddenly, we burst into a small clearing. The creature released its grip and I rolled to a stop, gasping and trembling. As I struggled to my feet, my legs shaking so badly I could barely stand, I saw that we were surrounded by towering trees. The forest seemed to close in around us, cutting off any hope of escape. Bigfoot stood at the edge of the clearing, its massive form blocking the way I had come. Those intelligent eyes studied me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. There was curiosity there, but also hunger, a primal, ancient hunger that sent ice through my veins. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The creature tilted its head, as if considering my words. For a brief, mad moment, I wondered if it could understand me. But then it let out a roar that shook the very ground, showering me with leaves and debris from the surrounding trees. I stumbled backward, my back pressing against a massive oak. There was nowhere left to run, nowhere to hide. The creature advanced slowly, deliberately, savoring the moment. As it drew closer, I could see every detail of its terrifying form. The matted fur, caked with mud and leaves, the massive hands, ending in wickedly sharp claws, and those eyes, gleaming with an intelligence that shouldn't exist in a creature so primitive and brutal. "I'm not going down without a fight," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. I grabbed a fallen branch, holding it out in front of me like a sword. It was a pitiful weapon against such a monster, but it was all I had. The creature paused, studying the branch with what almost looked like amusement in its eyes. Then, with speed that defied its size, it lunged forward. I swung the branch with all my might, connecting with its shoulder. But the blow that should have felled a man seemed to have no effect on this beast. With a swipe of its massive hand, it knocked the branch from my grasp, sending it flying into the underbrush. Before I could react, the creature's hand wrapped around my throat, lifting me off the ground as if I were a rag doll. I gasped for air, my feet dangling uselessly as I was slammed against the tree trunk. Stars danced in my vision as my head cracked against the bark. Through the haze of pain and lack of oxygen, I saw the creature's face inches from mine. Its hot, rancid breath washed over me as it leaned in close, studying me with an unsettling intensity. In that moment, staring into those inhuman eyes, I saw something that chilled me to my core. There was intelligence there, yes, but also a cold, calculating cruelty. This wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. This was a predator, toying with its prey. Just as the edges of my vision began to darken, the creature released its grip. I collapsed to the ground, gasping and coughing. As I struggled to draw breath, I looked up to see Bigfoot still looming over me, watching my every move. "What are you waiting for?" I croaked, my throat raw and painful. "Just get it over with." The creature tilted its head again, and for a moment, I could have sworn I saw a flicker of something almost like curiosity in its eyes. Then it raised its massive hand and I braced myself for the killing blow. But the attack never came. Instead, a distant sound caught both our attentions, the unmistakable bark of a dog, followed by human voices. Search party? Rangers? I didn't know, and in that moment I didn't care. All that mattered was that help might be coming. The creature's head snapped towards the sound, its body tensing. For a moment it seemed torn between finishing me off and fleeing. Then with a final bone-chilling roar, it turned and bounded into the forest, disappearing into the gathering darkness with impossible speed and silence. I lay there on the forest floor, my entire body trembling with a mixture of relief, pain, and lingering terror. The voices were growing closer, but they still sounded far away. Would they find me in time? And if they did, would they believe my story? As the adrenaline began to fade, the full extent of my injuries made themselves known. Every inch of me ached, and I could feel warm blood trickling from various cuts and scrapes. But I was alive. Somehow, against all odds, I had survived an encounter with a creature that shouldn't exist. I tried to call out to the search party, but my abused throat could only manage a weak croak. Darkness was closing in. Whether from nightfall or my own fading consciousness, I couldn't tell. As I lay there, drifting on the edge of awareness, one thought kept circling through my mind. This isn't over. Somehow I knew that my encounter with Bigfoot wasn't finished. The creature was still out there. And something told me that our paths would cross again before this nightmare truly ended. The last thing I heard before unconsciousness claimed me was the sound of voices and dogs growing closer. Help was coming. But as the darkness took me, I couldn't shake the feeling that the real ordeal was just beginning. I drifted in and out of consciousness, the pain from my injuries mixing with the lingering terror of my encounter. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those inhuman eyes staring back at me, filled with a primal hunger that chilled me to my core. The forest around me had fallen eerily silent, as if holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. I'm not sure how long I lay there on the forest floor, my body battered and my mind reeling from the impossible reality I had just experienced. The sound of voices and dogs barking in the distance gave me a flicker of hope, but it also filled me with a new kind of dread. What if the creature was still out there waiting? What if it decided to come back and finish what it had started? Help! I tried to call out, but my voice was barely a whisper, my throat raw from screaming and the creature's brutal grip. As the search party's voices grew closer, I struggled to sit up, every movement sending waves of pain through my body. I had to warn them, had to make them understand the danger they were in. But how could I explain something so unbelievable, so terrifying? Suddenly, a beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the clearing. I squinted against the harsh glare, relief and fear warring within me. "Over here," a gruff voice called out. I found him. Two figures emerged from the tree line, flashlights sweeping the area. As they approached, I could make out their uniforms, park rangers. Under different circumstances, I would have been overjoyed to see them. But now, all I could think about was the monster lurking in these woods. "Sir, are you all right?" one of the rangers asked, kneeling beside me. His eyes widened as he took in my battered state. "Jesus, what happened to you?" I opened my mouth to explain, but the words caught in my throat. How could I possibly describe what I had just been through? Would they even believe me? "Be Bigfoot," I finally managed to croak out. "It attacked me. We have to get out of here. It might come back." The rangers exchanged a look that I recognized all too well, concern mixed with skepticism. They clearly thought I was delirious. "Okay, sir. Just try to stay calm," the second ranger said, reaching for his radio. "We're going to get you out of here and to a hospital." As they called for medical assistance, I became aware of a new sound, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The rangers, focused on tending to my injuries, didn't seem to notice. But I knew that sound. It was etched into my very soul. "Listen," I gasped, grabbing the nearest ranger's arm. "Can't you hear it? It's coming back." The ranger gently but firmly removed my hand. "Sir, you're safe now. There's nothing out there but us and the search dogs. You've been through a traumatic experience, but I promise you, there's no such thing as Bigfoot." I wanted to scream in frustration. How could they not understand? How could they be so blind to the danger we were all in? But before I could argue further, a massive shadow fell over us, blotting out the stars. Time seemed to slow as I watched the creature emerge from the darkness. It moved with that impossible grace that belied its enormous size, its eyes gleaming with predatory intelligence. The rangers, finally alerted to its presence, spun around, their hands flying to their holstered weapons. "What the hell?" one of them began, but his words were cut off by a roar that shook the very ground beneath us. Bigfoot's massive hand wrapped around my ankle, dragging me across the forest floor as if I weighed nothing. I clawed desperately at the ground, my fingernails breaking and bleeding as I tried in vain to escape the monster's grasp. "Help me!" I screamed, my voice raw and desperate. "Shoot it! Do something!" The rangers, to their credit, recovered quickly from their shock. I heard the sharp crack of gunfire, saw muzzle flashes illuminating the clearing. But if the bullets had any effect on the creature, it didn't show it. It continued to drag me away, its grip unyielding. I felt its hot, rancid breath on my face as it leaned in close, studying me with an unsettling intelligence in its eyes. For a moment I thought I saw something there. Not just hunger or rage, but a cold, calculating cruelty that was almost human in its intensity. Just as I thought it was over, that this impossible creature would finally end me, a distant gunshot rang out. It was louder than the ranger's weapons, more powerful. Bigfoot reared back, roaring in pain or surprise. I couldn't tell which. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The creature's eyes met mine one last time, and I saw something there I hadn't expected. Fear. Then, with a speed that defied its size, it released me and bounded into the forest, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as it had appeared. I lay there on the forest floor, gasping for air, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. The rangers rushed to my side, their faces pale with shock and disbelief. "Are you all right?" one of them asked, his voice shaking. What was that thing?" I tried to answer, but the words wouldn't come. The adrenaline was fading, and with it, my grasp on consciousness. As darkness began to close in around the edges of my vision, I heard the sound of more people arriving. The rest of the search party, I assumed. "We need a medevac now," someone shouted, "and get the game warden out here. You're not going to believe what we just saw." As I drifted off, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The creature was still out there somewhere in these vast, dark woods, and something told me that our paths would cross again before this nightmare was truly over. The last thing I remember before unconsciousness claimed me was being lifted onto a stretcher, the voices of the rangers and search party members swirling around me in a confused babble. They were arguing about what they had seen, trying to rationalize the impossible. But I knew the truth. I had looked into the eyes of a legend, had felt its brutal strength and primal hunger. And as the helicopter blades whirred to life above me, carrying me away from this forest of nightmares, one thought echoed through my mind. Bigfoot was real, and it wasn't finished with me yet. I drifted in and out of consciousness, the rhythmic thump of helicopter blades cutting through the fog in my mind. Every time I opened my eyes, I saw flashes of concerned faces, medical equipment, and the dark landscape rushing by below. But each time I blinked, I was back in that forest clearing, staring into those inhuman eyes. "Stay with us, sir," a voice said, seeming to come from far away. "We're almost at the hospital." I tried to speak, to warn them about the creature still out there, but my throat felt raw and swollen. All I could manage was a weak groan. "BP's dropping," another voice said urgently. "We need to get him stabilized." As they worked on me, I felt a surge of frustration. They didn't understand. None of them understood the true danger we were all in. Bigfoot was real, and it was still out there waiting. The next thing I knew, I was being wheeled through bright fluorescent lit corridors. The stark white walls and antiseptic smell of the hospital were a jarring contrast to the dark, primal forest I'd just escaped. "Male, mid-30s, found in Monongahela National Forest," a paramedic was saying to someone. "Multiple lacerations, possible concussion, signs of physical trauma." "Any idea what happened to him?" a new voice asked. A doctor, I assumed. There was a pause, and I could almost feel the paramedic's discomfort. "He claims he was attacked by Bigfoot." I wanted to scream, to make them understand that it wasn't a claim. It was the truth. But before I could muster the strength, darkness claimed me again. When I next opened my eyes, I found myself in a hospital room. The pain had dulled to a persistent ache, and my head felt clearer than it had since the attack. Sunlight streamed through the window, telling me that at least a day had passed since my rescue. A nurse noticed I was awake and approached with a kind smile. "Good morning, Mr. Foster. How are you feeling?" "Like I've been hit by a truck," I croaked, my voice still rough. "How long have I been here?" "You were brought in late last night," she replied, checking my vitals. "You've been in and out of consciousness for about 12 hours now." As she worked, I noticed two men in suits enter the room. They had an air of authority about them that immediately put me on edge. "Mr. Foster," one of them said, flashing a badge. "I'm Agent Thompson, and this is Agent Rodriguez. We're with the FBI. We'd like to ask you a few questions about what happened in the forest if you're feeling up to it." I nodded, hope rising in my chest. Maybe they would believe me. Maybe they knew something about the creature. "Can you tell us, in your own words, what attacked you?" Agent Rodriguez asked, his pen poised over a notepad. I took a deep breath, wincing at the pain in my ribs. "It was Bigfoot," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "I know how it sounds, but I'm telling you, it was real. 8 feet tall, covered in fur, with strength like you wouldn't believe." The agents exchanged a look I couldn't quite interpret. "And you're certain it wasn't a bear?" Agent Thompson asked. "The Forest Service reported increased bear activity in that area." I shook my head vehemently, ignoring the wave of dizziness the motion caused. "It wasn't a bear. It walked on 2 legs, had hands with opposable thumbs, and its eyes. They were intelligent, almost human, but not quite." As I spoke, I could see the doubt creeping into their expressions. They didn't believe me. Of course they didn't. How could they? If I hadn't lived through it myself, I wouldn't have believed it either. "Mr. Foster," Agent Rodriguez said gently, "you've been through a traumatic experience. It's not uncommon for the mind to create explanations for things it can't fully process." "I'm not crazy," I insisted, my frustration growing. "Ask the Rangers who found me. They saw it too." "We've spoken to the Rangers," Agent Thompson said. "They reported seeing a large animal, but in the darkness and confusion they couldn't positively identify what it was. The official report lists it as a possible bear attack." I felt a crushing weight settle on my chest. They were going to bury this, to explain it away as something mundane and explainable. And who would believe me over the FBI? "What about the gunshot?" I asked, grasping at straws. "The one that scared it off? That wasn't from the Rangers." The agents shared another look. "There's no evidence of any other shots being fired," Rodriguez said. "Just those from the Rangers' service weapons." I slumped back against the pillows, defeat washing over me. They had an explanation for everything, a way to rationalize the impossible. And without any concrete evidence, my story was just that, a story. As the agents left, promising to follow up if they had any more questions, I felt a crushing sense of isolation. I knew what I had seen, what I had experienced, but how could I make anyone else understand? The day wore on, a parade of doctors, nurses, and well-meaning visitors coming and going. Each time I tried to explain what had really happened, I was met with pitying looks and gentle suggestions that I might benefit from talking to a therapist. As night fell, I found myself alone in the darkened hospital room. The beeping of monitors and the distant sounds of the hospital faded away as I stared out the window, my mind replaying the attack in vivid detail. That's when I saw it, a massive shadow moving at the edge of the parking lot, just beyond the circle of light cast by a street lamp. For a moment, my heart stopped. Had it followed me here? I blinked, and the shadow was gone. But the fear remained, a cold knot in the pit of my stomach. I knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that this wasn't over. Bigfoot was still out there, and somehow I knew our paths would cross again. As I lay there in the sterile hospital room, surrounded by the trappings of modern civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had glimpsed something ancient and primal, something that didn't care about our laws, our science, our carefully constructed explanations of how the world worked. I may have escaped the forest, but the true nightmare was just beginning, because now I knew the truth, and that truth was more terrifying than any legend could ever be. The sterile hospital room felt like a prison. Every beep of the monitors, every squeak of nurses' shoes in the hallway made me flinch. I hadn't slept more than a few minutes at a time since being admitted, my mind replaying the attack in vivid, terrifying detail every time I closed my eyes. A knock at the door jolted me from my thoughts. 2 police officers entered, their faces a mixture of professional detachment and poorly concealed skepticism. "Mr. Foster," the older of the 2 said, "I'm Officer Jenkins, and this is Officer Ramirez. We'd like to take your statement about the incident in Monongahela National Forest." I nodded, steeling myself for the disbelief I knew was coming. "Of course. What do you want to know?" Officer Ramirez pulled out a notepad. "Just start from the beginning. Tell us exactly what happened." I took a deep breath, wincing at the pain in my ribs. I was camping alone. On the second night, I heard something outside my tent. It was big, much bigger than a bear. When I looked out, I paused, knowing how insane it would sound. I saw Bigfoot. The officers exchanged a look I'd become all too familiar with, a mixture of pity and doubt. "Mr. Foster," Officer Jenkins said gently, "I understand you've been through a traumatic experience. But are you sure it wasn't just a bear? The Forest Service has reported increased bear activity in that area." I shook my head vehemently. It wasn't a bear. This thing was 8 feet tall, walked on 2 legs. It had hands, actual hands with opposable thumbs. And its eyes, they were intelligent, almost human, but not quite. As I recounted the attack, the chase through the forest, and the final confrontation, I could see the disbelief growing in their eyes. By the time I finished, Officer Ramirez wasn't even bothering to take notes anymore. "Look," I said, frustration building. "I know how it sounds. If I hadn't lived through it, I wouldn't believe it either. But I'm telling you the truth. This thing is real, and it's still out there." Officer Jenkins sighed. "Mr. Foster, we appreciate your cooperation. We'll include your statement in our report. Is there anything else you'd like to add?" I slumped back against the pillows, defeat washing over me. "No," I muttered. "That's everything." As the officers left, I heard them talking in low voices outside my door. "Poor guy," Ramirez said. "Must have been one hell of a bear to mess him up like that." "Yeah," Jenkins replied. "Trauma does funny things to the mind. He probably just needs some time and maybe some counseling." Their words stung, but I couldn't blame them. How could they possibly understand what I'd been through? The day wore on, a parade of doctors, nurses, and well-meaning visitors coming and going. Each time I tried to explain what had really happened, I was met with pitying looks and gentle suggestions that I might benefit from talking to a therapist. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across my room, a new visitor arrived. It was Sarah, my girlfriend. Her face was pale with worry as she rushed to my bedside. "Nick," she breathed, taking my hand. "Oh my God, I came as soon as I heard. Are you okay? What happened?" I looked into her eyes, seeing the concern and love there. For a moment, I considered lying, telling her it was just a bear attack like everyone seemed to believe. But I couldn't. I needed someone to believe me, to understand what I'd been through. "Sarah," I said, my voice low and intense, "I need you to listen to me. What I'm about to tell you is going to sound crazy, but I swear it's the truth." I told her everything. The night sounds, the massive footprints, the chase through the forest, and the final terrifying confrontation. As I spoke, I saw the same doubt creep into her expression that I'd seen on the faces of the police and doctors. "Nick," she said when I finished, her voice gentle but strained, "you've been through something terrible. Your mind is probably just trying to make sense of it all. Maybe you should talk to someone. A professional, I mean." Her words hit me like a physical blow. Even Sarah, the person who knew me best in the world, didn't believe me. "I'm not crazy," I insisted, my voice rising. "I know what I saw, what I experienced. Why won't anyone believe me?" Sarah flinched at my outburst, and I immediately regretted it. "I'm sorry," I said, softer now. I need someone to believe me." She squeezed my hand, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and worry. "I believe that you believe it, Nick. Isn't that enough for now?" But it wasn't enough. As Sarah left that evening, promising to return the next day, I felt more alone than ever. I turned to my phone, scrolling through news reports about my animal attack. Every article dismissed the Bigfoot angle as the delusions of a traumatized victim. There was no mention of the ranger's encounter with the creature, no hint of the true terror that lurked in those woods. As night fell, the hospital grew quiet. The darkness seemed to press in on me, and every shadow made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was out there, watching, waiting. A nurse came in to check my vitals, her movements efficient and impersonal. As she worked, I noticed her glancing at me with a mixture of curiosity and unease. "Is it true?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you really see, Bigfoot?" For a moment, hope flared in my chest. "Yes," I said earnestly. "I know it sounds impossible, but it's true. It's real, and it's still out there." The nurse's expression shifted from curiosity to pity. "I'm sorry," she said, patting my arm. "You've been through a lot. Try to get some rest, okay?" As she left, I felt the last of my hope drain away. No one was going to believe me. I was alone with this knowledge, this terrible truth that no one else could or would accept. Alone in the dark hospital room, I scrolled through my phone, desperate for any information that might corroborate my story. That's when I saw it. A small news item about missing hikers in the Monongahela National Forest. The article was vague, mentioning only that search parties had found no trace of the missing people. My blood ran cold as I realized the implications. The creature was still out there, still hunting, and I was the only one who knew the truth. As I stared out the window into the darkness beyond, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Bigfoot was real, and it was still out there. And somehow I knew that our paths would cross again before this nightmare truly ended. The night stretched on, long and filled with terrors both real and imagined. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound a potential threat. And through it all, one thought echoed in my mind. I had to find a way to make people believe me. Because if I didn't, who knew how many more would fall victim to the monster that lurked in the woods? The morning light filtering through the hospital window did little to ease my anxiety. Despite the doctor's assurances that I was on the mend, I felt a deep-seated unease that no amount of painkillers could touch. I knew what I had seen, what I had experienced, and the fact that no one believed me was eating away at my sanity. A knock at the door interrupted my brooding. To my surprise, it was Ranger Thompson, the man who had issued my camping permit just days ago. He looked haggard, with dark circles under his eyes and a grim set to his jaw. "Mr. Foster," he said, closing the door behind him. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been hit by a truck," I replied, wincing as I shifted in the bed. "But I'm guessing you're not here for a social call." Thompson shook his head. "No, I'm not. I need to ask you some questions about what happened in the forest. Off the record." My heart rate picked up. Could it be that someone finally believed me? "What do you want to know?" The ranger pulled up a chair, leaning in close. "I need you to tell me exactly what you saw out there. And I mean exactly. Don't leave anything out, no matter how crazy it might sound." I took a deep breath and began recounting my experience. As I spoke, I watched Thompson's face carefully, looking for any sign of disbelief or mockery. But his expression remained neutral, his eyes intent. When I finished, he sat back, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Jesus," he muttered. "I was afraid of this." "You believe me?" I asked, hardly daring to hope. Thompson's eyes met mine, and I saw a flicker of fear in them. "I've been a ranger in these parts for 30 years, Mr. Foster. In that time, I've seen things that don't fit neatly into any scientific explanation. But what you're describing, it's beyond anything I've encountered." He stood up abruptly. "Get dressed. We're going on a little field trip." An hour later, against medical advice, I found myself in Thompson's ranger vehicle heading back towards the Monongahela National Forest. My heart raced as we approached the area where I had camped, memories of terror flooding back. "Why are we here?" I asked, my voice tight with anxiety. "Because I need to see for myself," Thompson replied grimly. "And because if what you're saying is true, we need evidence." We parked at the ranger station and began the hike to my former campsite. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. I half expected to see that massive, terrifying form emerge from the trees at any moment. As we neared the clearing where I had set up my tent, Thompson held up a hand, signaling me to stop. "Wait here," he said, drawing his sidearm. "I'll check it out first." I watched as he cautiously entered the clearing, his eyes scanning the area. After a few tense minutes, he waved me over. "It's clear," he said. "But take a look at this." My breath caught in my throat as I saw what he was pointing at. The clearing was a mess, with broken branches and churned-up earth everywhere. But what caught my attention were the footprints. Massive, human-like prints that dwarfed Thompson's boot. "Oh God," I whispered. "It's real." It was all real. Thompson knelt by one of the prints, examining it closely. "I've never seen anything like this," he muttered. "It's not a bear, that's for damn sure." As we continued to survey the area, I felt a mix of vindication and renewed terror. Here was the proof I had been desperate for, but it also confirmed that the nightmare I had lived through was all too real. Our investigation was cut short by the sound of voices approaching. Thompson quickly ushered me behind a large tree, just as two men in suits entered the clearing. "Agents?" I heard Thompson greet them, his voice carefully neutral. "What brings the FBI out here?" "Routine follow-up, Ranger," one of the agents replied. "We're just making sure we haven't missed anything in our initial investigation." From my hiding spot, I watched as the agents surveyed the scene. To my horror, I saw one of them deliberately scuff out one of the massive footprints with his shoe. "Looks like standard bear activity to me," the other agent said loudly. "Wouldn't you agree, Ranger Thompson?" There was a pause before Thompson replied, his voice strained. "Yes, that's what it looks like." As the agents left, Thompson signaled for me to stay put. Once they were out of earshot, he returned, his face grim. "What the hell was that?" I demanded. "They're covering it up." Thompson nodded, his expression troubled. "It wouldn't be the first time. There are things in these woods that some people think are better left unknown." As we made our way back to the ranger station, my mind reeled. The creature was real. The attack had happened. But now it seemed that forces beyond my understanding were working to keep it all secret. Back at the hospital, Thompson left me with a warning. "Be careful who you talk to about this, Mr. Foster. Not everyone wants the truth to come out." As I lay in my hospital bed that night, sleep eluded me. The trip to the forest had confirmed my experiences, but it had also opened up a whole new realm of questions and fears. Who were those agents really? Why were they covering up evidence of Bigfoot? And most terrifyingly, was the creature still out there, waiting for its next victim? I stared out the window into the darkness, feeling more alone than ever. I had seen the truth with my own eyes, had touched the evidence with my own hands. But in a world determined to deny the existence of monsters, who would believe the ravings of one traumatized camper? As the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The creature was still out there, and now I knew that there were human forces at work to keep its existence a secret. Somehow I knew that my encounter with Bigfoot, and the conspiracy surrounding it, was just the beginning of a much larger, more terrifying story. Weeks have passed since my encounter with Bigfoot in the Monongahela National Forest, but the terror of those moments still haunts me. Every night I jolt awake, my body drenched in cold sweat, the memory of those inhuman eyes burning in my mind. The doctors call it PTSD, but how can I explain that my fears aren't just echoes of past trauma, but a very real, very present danger that no one else seems to acknowledge? Tonight is no different. I sit up in bed, heart pounding, ears straining for any sound that might indicate the creature has somehow followed me home. Sarah stirs beside me, her hand reaching out to touch my arm. "Another nightmare?" she asks, her voice thick with sleep and concern. I nod, unable to find the words to describe the terror that grips me. How can I explain that every shadow seems to hide a monstrous form, that every unexpected sound makes me flinch? "Nick," Sarah says, sitting up and turning on the bedside lamp. "Maybe it's time we talked about seeing someone, a therapist, I mean. These nightmares are getting worse and I'm worried about you." I shake my head vehemently. I don't need a therapist, Sarah. I need people to believe me. What I saw out there was real. Bigfoot is real, and it's still out there. Sarah's face falls, and I see the now familiar mix of pity and frustration in her eyes. Nick, we've been over this. You went through a traumatic experience. Your mind is just trying to make sense of it all. You think I'm crazy, I say, the words bitter in my mouth. No, I don't think you're crazy, she replies, but I can hear the doubt in her voice. I think you're hurt and scared, and you need help to process what happened. I turn away, staring out the window into the darkness beyond. How can I make her understand? How can I make anyone understand the primal terror of coming face to face with a creature that shouldn't exist? The next morning, I find myself obsessively scrolling through news reports on my phone. Every story about missing hikers or unexplained animal attacks catches my attention. Could Bigfoot be responsible? Are there more of these creatures out there? A headline makes me pause. Search continues for missing campers in Monongahela National Forest. My blood runs cold as I read the details. 3 hikers, last seen in the same area where I had my encounter. The article mentions signs of animal activity at their campsite. Sarah, I call out, my voice tight with urgency. Look at this. It's happening again. She comes over, reading the article over my shoulder. I see her expression shift from curiosity to concern, not for the missing hikers, but for me. Nick, she says gently, this doesn't prove anything. Animals' attacks happen in the forest all the time. This isn't just an animal attack, I insist. It's him. It's Bigfoot. We have to do something. We have to warn people. Sarah takes the phone from my hand, setting it aside. What we need to do is get you some help. I've made an appointment with Dr. Larson. He's a trauma specialist. I really think talking to him could help. I want to argue to make her see the truth, but the look in her eyes stops me. She's scared. Not of Bigfoot, but of what this obsession is doing to me. To us. Later that day, I find myself in Dr. Larson's office. The walls are lined with degrees and certifications meant to inspire confidence. But all I can think about is how none of his education has prepared him for the truth I'm about to share. So, Nick, Dr. Larson says, his voice calm and professional, why don't you tell me about what happened in the forest? I take a deep breath and begin my story. As I speak, I watch his face carefully, looking for any sign of belief. But all I see is the same clinical detachment I've encountered from every other professional. When I finish, Dr. Larson leans back in his chair, studying me. Nick, what you've been through is incredibly traumatic. It's not uncommon for the mind to create explanations for events it can't fully process. This Bigfoot could be your mind's way of giving form to the fear you experienced. It's not in my mind, I say, frustration building. It was real. I saw it. I smelled it. I felt its hands on me. Why won't anyone believe me? Dr. Larson's expression softens. I believe that you believe it, Nick. And that's what we need to work on. We need to help you process this trauma in a healthy way. As I leave the office, I feel more alone than ever. Even the professionals, the people trained to help, can't or won't see the truth. That evening, I stand at my window staring out into the gathering darkness. The trees at the edge of our property seem to loom larger, their shadows stretching towards the house like grasping fingers. Sarah comes up behind me, wrapping her arms around my waist. What are you thinking about? She asks softly. I can't shake the feeling that it's not over, I reply, my eyes still fixed on the tree line. Bigfoot is still out there, and what if it remembers me? What if it comes looking for me? Sarah tightens her embrace. Nick, you're safe here. Nothing is going to hurt you. But even as she says it, I see movement at the edge of the woods. A shadow, larger than any man, slips between the trees. My heart races, and I blink hard, sure that my mind is playing tricks on me. When I look again, the shadow is gone. Did you see that? I ask, my voice barely above a whisper. See what? Sarah replies, peering out into the darkness. I shake my head, suddenly unsure. Nothing. It was nothing. But as I turn away from the window, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched, that somewhere out there, in the vast wilderness that borders our civilized world, a creature beyond our understanding is waiting, watching, planning. I know now that I will never feel truly safe again. The encounter in the forest has changed me fundamentally, opening my eyes to a world of hidden dangers and unacknowledged truths. Bigfoot is real, and it's still out there. And no matter how much time passes, no matter how many therapists try to convince me otherwise, I know that the nightmare is far from over. As I lie in bed that night, sleep eludes me. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside, sends my heart racing. I stare at the ceiling, replaying every moment of my encounter, searching for some detail I might have missed, some clue that might make others believe me. But deep down, I know the truth. I am alone with this knowledge, this burden. And as the night wears on, I can't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, in the darkness beyond my window, Bigfoot is waiting, watching. And someday, somehow, our paths will cross again. The true horror, I realize, is not just the existence of the creature, but the isolation of knowing a truth that no one else will accept. And as I finally drift into an uneasy sleep, one thought echoes through my mind. This is only the beginning.